Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy to welcome everyone who is with us today. Unfortunately, we are living in very special times and I can't see you in person because this year this conference must be held online. Once again, welcome to the 29th International Security Conference in Cracow entitled Will the Pandemic Change the Architecture of Global Security? Traditionally, the Institute for Strategic Studies organized conferences in cooperation with NATO headquarters and Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. This year, we are also honored to welcome the US Consulate General in Krakow. I would like you to thank for being here with us today, which is especially important in these complicated times. A few days ago, the Deputy Secretary General of NATO, Mr. Mircea Joana, said, quote, "The pandemic is also shaping our security. Even the idea of what security means. Traditionally, security issues discussed at conferences have focused on military operations, troop movements, or preventing terrorist attacks. But now we all need to be resilient, and we need to be prepared for the post-pandemic economy and the geopolitics, which appear to be leading the world into a new, more turbulent historical cycle. But this pandemic is not the only challenge we have to face. For NATO members, transatlantic ties are one of the main pillars of our security. In recent years, the quality of these relations has been the subject of many discussions. President Trump's transactional, business-oriented approach to security issues has been very controversial. Today, in anticipation of the outcome of the presidential election in the United States, we should consider how the result of this election and the possible change of the president will affect relations between the allies. A few days ago, Joe Biden assessed Donald Trump's policy as such. NATO is in danger of cracking because the allies have doubts about if we are really there, Biden said. His major foreign policy advisor, Mr. Michael Carpenter, has recently said that Mr. Biden is committed to ensuring the security of all allies on the eastern flank and especially Poland. He also added that it would be a values-based relationship, not transactional, that is about our shared belief in the rule of law and democracy. These are announcements of a change in the course of the US administration after Biden's possible victory, which could be important for relations within NATO and with players outside the alliance. Other important issues include the heated events of recent weeks in Belarus, Vladimir Putin's foreign policy aspiration, and the war in Nagorno-Karabakh. All of these events show that the eastern flank of the alliance requires a lot of attention. And these are the issues that we will be reflecting on today. We have a long list of distinguished speakers. Thank you all for accepting our invitation. I would like to welcome a special guest of the conference, Mr. Camille Grant, Assistant Secretary General for Defense Investment, who will give the keynote speech. And I warmly welcome the panelists and moderators. Dr. Florence Gaub, EU Institute for Security Studies, Paris. Minister Radosław Sikorski, Chairman of the Delegation for Relations with the United States, European Parliament, former Minister of Foreign Affairs in Poland. Ambassador Daniel Fried, former US Ambassador to Poland, Atlantic Council, Washington. Ambassador Piotr Łukasiewicz, Ambassador Ryszard Schnepf, Ambassador Rolf Nickel, German Council on Foreign Relations, former German ambassador to Poland, Dr. Wojciech Miknich, Jagiellonian University, Cracow, Ambassador Alexander Vergeboe, former NATO Deputy Secretary General, Atlantic Council, Washington, Dr. Małgorzata Bonikowska, Center for International Relations, Warsaw, Mr. Robert Pszczell, Senior Officer for Russia and Western Balkans, Public Diplomacy Division, NATO HQ, Senator Bogdan Klich, Chairman of the Foreign and European Union Affairs Committee, former Minister of National Defense of Poland, Mr. Konstantin von Egert, Deutsche Welle, Mr. Michał Baranowski, Director of the Warsaw Office of the German Marshall Fund. Once again, thank you very much, and I do appreciate your time. I hope that the next Jubilee 30th conference will be held in traditional way in Krakow, and we will meet in some months, hopefully, under better circumstances. Now I encourage you to participate in discussion and ask questions. It's possible to do on YouTube chat rooms. And now I give the floor, maybe the screen, to Ambassador Piotr Łukasiewicz, who will lead the session with Mr. Camille Grant. Mr. Ambassador, Mr. Secretary, the screen, the floor is yours. Thank you.
We are about to start the Institute for Strategic Studies online conference with a really great opening, pun intended, because our keynote speaker today is Mr. Camille Grant, Assistant Secretary General for Defense Investment at NATO since October 2016. His professional biography makes him an ideal example of the service and career dedicated to science, research, and public security. And this is really an ideal mix of think tank and public experience. He was a director of the Foundation for Strategic Research, a leading French think tank in defense and security. And he also held senior positions in French ministries of foreign affairs and defense. He also taught at Paris Sciences Po and National School of Administration, both very distinguished academic institutions. He is also a good friend of this annual conference and of the Krakow Institute for Strategic Studies. I am pleased to welcome him via video link from Brussels. During the Mr. Grant keynote, our viewers may ask questions in the chat window on YouTube, also Facebook. Mr. Grant, the screen is yours.
Ambassador, thank you so much for your kind words, and let me also thank the Institute for their kind invitation. It's really a pleasure to be back at this Krakow conference, and I'm delighted to be with you again. Unfortunately, not in person, but via screen. But I think this is the situation that we're all in these days. But I really look forward to what is going to be a lively, interesting, and relevant afternoon, focused on a very, very important topic for our alliance in particular. So in these times of widespread uncertainty, there is at least one thing we can be sure of. The world is in the midst of deep and unprecedented changes. 2020 has been a year of extraordinary change. Coronavirus has had a deep impact on all of us and in many, many different ways. The COVID crisis is first and foremost a health crisis, but it has also proven to be much more than that. Indeed, while the COVID-19 pandemic is certainly not the starting point of the change of our world, it is accelerating the pace of change, and I would posit more importantly, it is shaping our security by putting existing challenges under a new perspective. Hybrid threats, cyber attacks, disinformation were all happening before COVID. but they have taken a new, larger dimension with the pandemic that has an impact on all of our societies. Existing security trends, such as Russian military activities, as well as embattled activities by terrorist groups, have also been magnified by the crisis. So beyond the alliance's immediate response to the health crisis and the expression of close solidarity amongst allies, the COVID-19 crisis is in fact bringing new clarity on areas that NATO needs to focus on in the future, on our core tasks to ensure the security and defense of our allies and the 1 billion citizens in the NATO countries. And I have to say that even if nobody anticipated the pandemic, NATO had anticipated quite a few of those areas and is well equipped to address current and future threats and challenges. NATO is working to make sure that this health crisis and related economic downturn does not become a security crisis, which is really our focus these days. So let me start by highlighting a few things about what it means for NATO. NATO is an alliance of democracies founded on shared values of democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law. These values lie at the core of what we do, standing together to defend our freedom, our open societies, our way of life. For more than 70 years, these values successfully guided our continuous adaptation to an ever-changing security environment. NATO has successfully adapted to the end of the Cold War, the rise of terrorism in and around the Euro-Atlantic area, a more assertive Russia, and the advent of cyberspace, to name just a few more recent examples. I think we can say in all fairness that NATO has never wasted a good crisis. And due to NATO's ability to learn fast and adapt rapidly, this organization has always emerged from those crises stronger and hopefully better equipped to address the next one. COVID-19 is no exception in this context. From the very beginning, NATO has expanded its horizon by firstly taking on new immediate tasks and secondly deepening the work it had already launched in some areas. Let me give you a short overview of our reaction. With regard to the direct engagement in the COVID-19 crisis, NATO and allied militaries have played a key role supporting the civilian response to COVID-19. So far, some 350 flights have delivered hundreds of tons of critical supplies around the world. Across the alliance, almost 500,000 troops have supported the civilian response, constructing more than 100 field hospitals, securing borders, and helping with testing. Allies and partners have supported each other with medical supplies, including masks, protective material, and medicine. Furthermore, in June, in anticipation of a second wave, which is already emerging in some countries, NATO defense minister took several decisions so that NATO is prepared to provide strong support to civilian efforts. Minister agreed on a new plan named Operation Allied Hand to ensure we are ready to help both allied and partners. They agreed to establish a stockpile of medical equipment and supplies and to set up a new trust fund for the purchase of supplies to provide immediate support. Contribution by allies to the trust fund currently run into the millions of euros. This will help ensure that critical assistance gets to the right place at the right time. We have already received offers of medical equipment from several allies. Just give me one example. In mid-September, the United States donated 200 ventilators to the stockpile. Allied military assets will also be used to distribute supplies from the stockpile to allies or partners in need. In essence, as I already mentioned, we are seeing solidarity in action. Solidarity has gone hand in hand with responsibility. Indeed, NATO has been very quick to take strict action to protect the health and well-being of its staff and military forces, both in its various headquarters and in the theater. For instance, in the HQ in Brussels, we've established a plan of layered measures that has allowed us to continue to deliver on our core tasks, conducting virtual meetings, including at ministerial level, while ensuring both business continuity and the safety of our staff. NATO has never closed down. As a result of these measures, and in spite of a worldwide lockdown, we continue to work without interruption on all of our core tasks. Beyond these immediate measures and response, NATO is also addressing this increasingly broad definition of security and is looking more widely at areas in which we were already engaged and in which the crisis has put at the forefront of the security agenda. Let me mention a couple of examples. Firstly, resilience. No matter how strong a nation is militarily, this alone cannot be enough. No matter what challenge one can think of, the first line of defense is a strong, resilient society, able to prevent, to endure, to adapt, and bounce back from whatever happens to it. So we need to place a far greater emphasis on resilience in the years to come, and resilience will be at the very core of our societies and our security. While resilience is a national responsibility, obviously, the individual commitment of each and every ally to maintain and strengthen its resilience reduces the vulnerability of NATO as a whole. Article 3 of the Washington Treaty, NATO's founding document, places a duty on all allies to work to make themselves more resilient. When the document was drafted, the founding members were concerned with an armed attack from the Soviet Union. But today we need to be resilient against a far broader range of threats and address the issue through a whole of society approach. We are not starting from scratch. At the 2016 summit in Warsaw, allies leaders decided to boost NATO's resilience to the full spectrum of threats and continue developing individual and collective capacity to resist any form of armed attack. They agreed 7 baseline requirements for national resilience against which member states can measure their level of preparedness. In this context, NATO allies have already agreed high standards for the resilience of our societies in areas such as the continuity of government, secure transport and communications, including 5G networks, energy, food and water supplies. We want to see now how we can strengthen these requirements, and we will discuss this at the meeting of NATO defense ministers this week, and we will continue working on further requirements by the next NATO summit that will take place in 2021. But resilience is not only a national responsibility and a collective effort. It also requires close coordinations with partners and international organizations, firstly the European Union. Secondly, innovation. NATO has always been at the forefront of new technology. And if there is a positive to be taken from the current crisis, it is the acceleration in the adoption of new technologies with benefits to our societies. NATO's challenge, and our opportunity as well, is to ensure we fully adopt and exploit these new technologies and gain their maximum benefit, while also planning and preparing for additional vulnerabilities they bring. NATO's ability to innovate in what has guaranteed our military superiority, including our technological edge, for the past 7 decades. This is the key to our success and will remain so. But NATO and the West may be on the verge of a new Sputnik moment, as the Deputy Secretary General said in a recent event. A moment where a non-Western power, not sharing the same values as we do, might actually overtake us in one domain. So we must redouble of our efforts, focus our investments even more on new cutting-edge capabilities. We're also working to ensure that NATO allies coordinate as they develop the new technologies. Never before has the issue of interoperability been more important. Beyond our efforts within the alliance, we are engaging with those who are driving technological innovation in the private sector, with the defense industry, the big tech companies, and of course the small startup across the whole alliance. Science and technology is increasingly becoming a formidable instrument of political power. Maintaining NATO's technological edge is key for the enduring success of our alliance. Thirdly, climate change. NATO is now more concerned than ever about security implication of climate change. The NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg just gave a speech on this subject only last month, in which he sets out the very real security threats that emanate from our changing climate. Drought, floods, and other extreme weathers are making life increasingly difficult for people around the world. All these are fueling conflicts, exacerbating existing threats, adding pressure on natural resources like food, water, and power, and driving migration. The fall in the price of oil we've seen this year, which looks set to continue, will have a dramatic impact on those nations that depend on the sale of oil and gas to fuel their economies, especially as more countries commit to achieving net zero emissions and moving away from fossil fuels towards renewable forms of energy. How those countries will react remains to be seen, but there are also certainly risks in this realm too. As I already alluded to, NATO is not alone in addressing these challenges. while threats not only come from any point of the compass, but affecting the entire world at the same time, our cooperation with our partners around the globe, and of course the EU, are paramount to make sure we tackle these global challenges together. In conclusion, it is clear that NATO has always been able to adapt to crises and challenges and learn lessons from them to enhance its relevance and readiness. COVID-19 is a new crisis we have to face, but it's not the last one. Recognizing this, in June of this year, the Secretary General launched NATO 2030. 3 lines of work will help ensure that the allies remain ready to face tomorrow's challenge. First, staying strong militarily by continuing to invest in our armored forces and modern military capabilities. In this, we already have a good news. European allies and Canada are projected to add $400 billion to their defense budget by 2024, and they've already added a cumulative $130 billion by this year, from 2016. Second, being more united politically, using NATO as the forum to discuss and where necessary to act on issues affecting our shared security. We must not forget that open discussion and different views are a sign of strength, an indication that differences do not undermine our fundamental values. Third, we taking a broader approach globally, working even more closely with like-minded partners to defend our values. We are already enhancing our cooperation with some partners, including the European Union, as mentioned, and continuously reinforcing with others. I will end with the obvious. We cannot foresee the future. Therefore, we have to prepare for the unexpected, as the COVID-19 crisis was unexpected just a year ago. We need a strategy to deal with uncertainty. That's what the Alliance has been doing for 70 years, and what our NATO 2030 exercise will deliver. With this, let me thank you again for this invitation to address this group, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much for this presentation and this keynote, very interesting one. We have a couple questions asked, well, via different channels, including YouTube. Let me ask, Mr. Grant, let me ask first question from Mr. Marek Świerczyński from Polityka Insight, my colleague. The question is as follows. Poland is about to launch an investment program aimed at expanding the military bases to be used by the US troops. And that includes debarkation ports, UAV bases, combat training center, etc. To what extent is NATO able to support these efforts in terms of funding, and what role does NATO see for them in terms of enhancing military mobility, readiness, and posture on the eastern flank? Thank you.
Thank you very much. First of all, Poland has been exemplary over the years for investing in defense. It has reached 2% target already a few years ago, and it's engaged in an active modernization of its armored forces, but also of its infrastructure. And this is something that we at NATO, of course, welcome very much. The enhanced infrastructure is an important step in our efforts to address some of the shortfalls that were identified. And Marek just listed some of our key features. Number one, military mobility. We know that the sort of challenge we might face require an ability to move forces around Europe and across the Atlantic in an efficient and timely manner. And we are well aware that there were some limitations to military mobility. Some of them were of legal or practical natures. Others had to do with infrastructure. Others had to do with the command and control mechanism. So this is where both allies, the NATO itself, must make an effort. So we've established a command in Ulm to facilitate this mobility across theater. We've also have a command in Norfolk to make sure that the transatlantic mobility is well taken care of. At the end of the day, what we are aiming at is an alliance that is guarantees the timely delivery of forces and equipment across the alliance, including on the eastern flank. There is an interesting footnote to that, which is for the first time, we had also a form of coordination with our EU colleagues, so that the European Union has decided to put some of its infrastructure budget into meeting military requirements, which will add some significant funding to what allies do nationally or within the NATO common funded budget. Secondly, the issue of readiness in that context is absolutely critical. We are in an environment where day zero readiness, day zero interoperability are very strong military requirements. And this is something that has to become an essential part of our posture. This is a long-term endeavor. This doesn't, it comes with a price tag, and it comes with a sustained effort to achieve this objective. But we've achieved quite significant progress already. And I'm confident that we will be moving in that direction even further in the coming months and years.
Next question from Mr. I believe it's João Marcos from YouTube. What is the perspective scenario for international security if in the year ahead to come, we strike with health crisis bigger than COVID-19 pandemic? Well, that's a difficult one because COVID is already a big crisis. But what is I believe the question is how NATO, is there a role for NATO in the health crises like we experience at the moment?
First of all, as I highlighted, NATO played its part in addressing the COVID crisis, and has developed planning to help further should the crisis develop or deepen. I would say two things. First of all, let us be clear about, as a starting point, that NATO is not primarily a health organization. WHO and national governments have the primary responsibilities in addressing health crisis. But NATO can certainly help in certain areas, and has done so since the COVID pandemic first erupted. By moving equipment around, we are good at logistics. We do have, the air forces of the alliance have been quite heavily solicited to support the deployment of equipment, the fielding of hospitals, or even moving patients around Europe in order to relieve the most affected zones. So those sorts of things are there. Should there be a treatment or a vaccine in the future, it will also be interesting to see if there can be some assistance to deploy those, not only within the alliance, but beyond. So those are some of the issues on which I can see NATO helping and being part of the solution. The second point I would raise is that NATO has a core responsibility in this period, which is to preserve the security of our citizens. And in a way, and I always come back to that quote from the Secretary General I mentioned during my speech, which is the fact that our core responsibility is to make sure that the health crisis doesn't turn into a security crisis, and that others don't take advantage of our governments being rightfully focused on addressing the health crisis to take advantage of that. And we've seen that the security environment has continued to deteriorate as the pandemic was unfolding. We've seen that through multiple political and security crises in our immediate environment, from Belarus to the Middle East or North Africa. So in this context, it is our duty to watch those crises carefully and be fully aware that the temptation might exist to take advantage of the health crisis to gain some security advantage.
Thank you. Another question from YouTube from someone called Filmentist. This is really about more about EU, but I think you could also add to that. The question is how the pandemic situation will possibly affect the migration scenarios inside EU zone in the foreseeable future. Are there any new regulations in this sphere? So maybe let me add a little bit NATO context to that, because there are NATO missions as well in the Mediterranean. What NATO is doing in context of migration during the COVID-19 times?
Well, NATO contributes as a small but important maritime mission in the Aegean that enables NATO allied navies to work together and support each other in also in the context of migration. What I would say about this is that, first of all, major pandemics such as COVID generally have a negative impact on migrations because and further accelerate trends when it comes to migrations because populations in already weakened or collapsed states tend to seek asylum, also to seek a better health for themselves and their families. So that is one element that we should not expect the COVID crisis to reduce the pressure on migration, quite the contrary. The second thing is that in this context, and a bit as I was mentioning, the political or strategic crisis, I think we have to stand ready for that. We have to recognize that that this is happening, and we have to make sure that the migration crisis, which has been on us for a number of years now, that the health dimension of that is also taken into account by as we see new refugees coming into the EU or Europe, that we also address the health challenge coming with this through an active testing policy and a policy of addressing that. Again, this is not a core mission for NATO, but I would say that the first respondents, whether they are international organizations, NGOs, HCR, the High Commissioner for Refugees, or the WHO, have that very much in mind as they look at addressing the flow of refugees.
Thank you. And I believe we have a few minutes for one more question or two. There's a question from Twitter, a rather long one. There's been a debate about how to link NATO and EU efforts on investment front, so that the military aspect and the requirements could be better served. How much progress have these discussions made? Are there any conclusions as to how to include military prerequisites into large EU co-funded projects? And is there a role for the United States in consultation of these discussions, given their military presence and the importance of the US defense planning for Europe?
Okay, let me try to break this down into, because there are three questions into one. So first of all, the European Union investing into defense is altogether good news, whether it's on military mobility or through the European Defense Fund into military technology. It was not traditionally a domain in which the Commission was active. The fact that it is becoming active is a good news for burden sharing, and it's a good news for NATO. Seen from NATO, what we need to do is two things. First of all, to have a good working relationship with our colleagues in the EU environment to make sure that the EU allocates the money to defense planning priorities that are consistent with the NATO defense planning priorities, and at least largely consistent. From that perspective, another good news was the fact that some of the first projects, some of the first pilot projects that were implemented do, for most of them, cover NATO defense planning priorities. So from this perspective, we are satisfied, which is quite normal because after all, we do have 21 members in common. So I would expect them to be consistent across the board. Then there is a third issue, which is how do we make sure that as much as possible, non-EU allies get a chance to be part of those projects. This is a bit of a sensitive one, and it has triggered a lot of discussions amongst EU member states and amongst allies. But I think it is fair to recognize that we operate in a transatlantic environment, and that many allies are working with the United States, that there are lots of transatlantic projects underway. It is also fair to recognize that the EU member states have a right to develop projects with EU money, mostly funding EU industries. So this is the balance we have to strike between those two imperatives. And I do believe that we've achieved quite a lot of progress in our engagements with the European Defence Agency, the European Commission, and our colleagues across the EU institutions to try to make sure that those efforts are well considered. There are obviously political sensitivities. We should always remember that in the NATO environment, we do have 9 allies that are not EU member states, and many of them have a different relationship to the EU. And all of this has to be taken into account when addressing the issue of third states and third-party entities.
Mr. Grant, just one small question from me, actually, regarding your keynote. You have mentioned a non-Western power that could eclipse NATO with their technology and scientific research in the coming years. I believe you meant China as this power, but is it only a technological competitor, or is it? What about the global policies? What about the military competition? What is the state of intra-NATO discussion vis-à-vis China right now?
Well, the China conversation has started within NATO, and we recognize China as both as a challenge and an opportunity, as it is for most of our countries and our economies. It's as the European Union puts it, a strategic competitor, but also of course, a major trading partner for all of our nations, usually the first or second trading partner for most of our nations. So in this context, what we have to recognize is that we have to think through what does China mean? And in a way, we have to recognize, I would say, a few things. Number one, whether we like it or not, China is coming to us in different ways. It is present in the Euro-Atlantic environment. It has some sort of initial military presence at sea in particular that we do see in the Mediterranean and as far as the Black Sea and in the High North. It is coming to us in the cyberspace, obviously, and it is also coming to us as a country which is pursuing a strategy of influence across our environment. So in this context, it is fair that we think through this, even if most NATO allies don't see themselves engaged in the Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific environment, it is there. The second thing is that in that context, we have to take appropriate measures to, as I mentioned in my speech, stay ahead of the technological race and make sure that developments in quantum technology, AI, artificial intelligence, or hypersonic vehicles are not pursued more efficiently by some of our peer competitors, not only China, but there might be others in that game as well. So in this context, it is important that we stay ahead of this game, which has been a very core strength for the political West for the last 70 years. So these are the thoughts that we have. Obviously, this is a big conversation amongst allies, and you will, as time unfolds, you will see more of that being rolled out at our foreign ministerial in December and at our summit next year. I think the allies will have come together in having a shared understanding and hopefully some also policy recommendations in that domain.
Mr. Grant, thank you very much for this keynote and for a very interesting question and answers session. And I would like to thank you, our audience, for the lively participation. Actually, the audience grew during your speech and during the Q&A session. Normally, I would like for a big round of applause, but let's just bang our desk wherever we are at the moment. Thank you very much. Thank you for this presentation. I would like to ask our audience to stay online because we'll take a 1 minute break, technical break, and we'll continue with the program of our conference. Thank you very much. Dzień dobry, to w takim razie ja już się odmeldowuję, tak?
All right. Good afternoon. I understand I can take my turn. I'm Ryszard Schnepf, and I am honored to moderate the next panel session. The COVID-19 pandemic as a trigger for change and the global security architecture is a very broad topic. We have very special guests, also my friends. I see many familiar faces. So even if pandemic makes our life a little bit more difficult, it's great to see you surviving. My special guests today are Dr. Florence Gaub. I welcome you, Deputy Director of the European Union Institute for Security Studies and expert on Middle East and North Africa. Good afternoon, Florence. I also welcome Radek Sikorski, member of European Parliament, former Sejm Speaker, Poland's Minister of Defense and Foreign Affairs, and what's not irrelevant, my former boss. You know how difficult it might be to ask questions to your former boss. Okay, I'm in this situation. Welcome, Radek. And also another friend, we've known each other like for more than 20 years, 30 years perhaps, Daniel Fried, former Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, United States Ambassador to Poland, still very well remembered here in Warsaw and in the whole country, and currently Distinguished Fellow of Washingtonian Atlantic Council. I cordially welcome all of you. Please apply, I'm talking to the speakers, the time control. We have kind of 3 sessions. That's how I scheduled it. And we have 5 minutes for each answer to pass next item and possible questions from the public. Okay, let me be a bit provocative and start with this. We, the Europeans, have got used to all kinds of threats and disasters, military conflict included. We had experienced genocide, famine, economic crisis. I must say we have known all bad things possible. Yet we, not only inhabitants of Europe, but people around the globe, feel surprised and defenseless in front of COVID-19 pandemic. Moreover, we, the Westerners, trusted fully in our political, economic, and technological power. Finally, we have NATO, the strongest military defense structure. Did we miss something coming? On the NATO headquarters website, I read, in responding to the COVID-19 pandemic, NATO continues to deliver credible and effective deterrence and defense. Our ability to conduct operations has not been undermined. Our forces remain ready and our crucial work goes on. From the start of the outbreak, NATO has implemented robust measures to limit the spread of the virus and minimize risks to our personnel and the communities that they serve. NATO military medical staff remain vigilant and are monitoring for any impact of NATO forces deployed on operations. Sounds nice. We've heard a lot from the Assistant Secretary. Shouldn't we expect more all civilians-oriented support, given the resources all member states dedicate to the alliance? Should it go more to the people so we feel NATO is with us, not only when it comes to defend our territories and our land security? Let me ask first, Florence, what do you think about it?
Given that I work for the EU, I think I'm not perhaps in the right position to judge what NATO is doing. But perhaps, you know, the question our panel is asking is whether COVID triggered a new security architecture. And of course, you know, we did a survey of all papers that were written about how COVID's going to change the world. And I think it was 17 papers that all came to the same conclusion. No, it won't. It will just accelerate existing trends, i.e. China and the United States are on collision course. China suddenly showed its true face. But I think after a while we realized that, you know, we're experiencing what I call the Eiffel Tower effect. So if you don't know the story, when the Eiffel Tower was built, there were some people in Paris that absolutely hated it. And one of them was a famous author. And what he did in order to avoid it was he would go inside and have lunch inside. Because when you're in the Eiffel Tower, you can't see it. And what I mean with that metaphor is that I think one thing that has changed is actually how in Europe we see the world. Of course, some of this discussion started earlier, started before COVID, but I think this vulnerability that we perceived when it came to supply chains, you know, especially face mask dependency on China, the United States just closing their air travel without even consulting. I mean, of course, this is after years of Trump administration. I think the whole debate on strategic sovereignty or strategic autonomy, no matter what you want to call it, I think that is the real change that has happened. That for the first time, I think in its history, the European Union is beginning to consider a world where it's not really having allies outside of the continent itself. Now, I'm not saying this will lead to a divorce with the US or anything. Of course, a lot depends on the elections. But I think that's the real thing that has changed. It's this profound sense of, I'm going to say, strategic loneliness that is becoming a real thing you can feel everywhere in Brussels.
Okay, thank you, Florence, for being brief. My question was concerning the issue that only some countries, they know how to use the support of NATO in sense of the using the military installations or transportations in order to feel that we are really members of something more than military alliance. Radek, this is your turn. Could you refer to this? Thank you.
Unmute. Now you can hear me, I hope.
Yeah.
Yes.
Hello, everyone. You asked whether we missed something, and we certainly did. I raised the issue of a possible biological threat to the world, to the alliance. I tried to put it on the agenda of several conferences on whose boards I sit, and I just couldn't get through. People were not taking this seriously. And I don't believe that this pandemic is man-made, but it could have been. There are several thousand laboratories around the world in which you can manufacture a virus. And so seeing how much damage this does, our enemies, I'm sure, are thinking about it. To answer your second question, Whether this is changing the architecture of security around the world, clearly not yet. The alliances are the same as they've been before, but it does change the correlation of forces. Some countries will be affected by this thing more than others. I think in particular, and this is a blow to NATO, the pandemic is a blow to the assumption of Anglo-Saxon competence. We've lived for decades thinking that, particularly in the areas of security and actually in medicine, when the British or the Americans do something, they mean business and they do it well. But you know, the financial crisis was a screw up. WikiLeaks was a screw up. Iraq, sorry, wasn't the most competently run operation. And so this is just another nail in the assumption and in the trust of the competence of our biggest ally. It is also having an impact on defense expenditures. At the European Parliament, I'm on the defense subcommittee, and I try to fight for a proper, a serious European defense budget. And there were, before the pandemic, there were the first inklings that it might come to pass. The Commission proposed 13 billion euros over 7 years for defense. It's not great, but it's a good beginning. And about 40% of that was supposed to be spent on military mobility around Europe, perfectly compatible with NATO. In fact, you know, I don't think there is anything better that NATO could see from the European Union. It's all now been slashed by half, and we'll be fighting to restore it, but it's an uphill struggle. Even though, of course, the pandemic is a little bit like defense, in the sense that defense is spending for what you cannot predict, for what you hope will never happen. But it's harder than before. So personally, I don't believe in any of that stuff about Europe's strategic autonomy or Europe becoming serious about defense and foreign policy, because to do it seriously, it's very expensive. And you need to follow the money, and the money just isn't there, and the pandemic means there'll be even less of it. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Dan, how does it look from the perspective of Washington? I'm not asking about the outcome of the election yet. Okay, your prediction. This is for another conversation. How would you react to the questions, or your thoughts would be very valuable?
Well, let me start from where Radek left off. In my experience, Radek always makes points worth taking seriously every time. I'm often not quite as dark as Radek, but his points are instructive, especially as a guide to action. I agree that COVID-19 is not changing the basic structure of international security. The alliances of democracies are still intact. The authoritarians, Russia, China, Turkey in its own way, are still doing what they're doing. But coronavirus puts pressure on all of us and all of our systems. It does change the correlation of forces. Now, certainly, it has been a blow to a sense of US competence. The Trump administration's incompetence has been revealed. I mean, there's no denying it. Although the recent surge in coronavirus in Europe shows that it really isn't just the Trump administration having difficulty with it, everybody's having difficulty with it. A second point I'd like to make is that whatever the pressure of the coronavirus on us, that is the democratic world, the free world, it is apt to be even stronger on the autocracies. I'm not sure I believe the rosy Chinese statistics of how well they're coping, and I'm certain few people on listening to this believe Russian rosy assessments of their own competence. So I think the coronavirus puts pressure on the West, on our system of alliances, and to get out of it, we have got to deal with some of the weaknesses that the coronavirus has revealed. And this is possible. The good news is that underlying the misery of where Trump has driven the transatlantic relationship is an emerging consensus between Europe and the United States about what has to be done. And I will predict that if Biden is elected, a Biden administration will be stronger on relations with Europe than the Obama administration was. Obama's people tended to be just a bit dismissive of Europe. That was the past, Asia was the future, and they indulged this kind of nonsense for some time, and they lost a window of opportunity. Obama did not use the political capital he had well enough to build things with Europe. Biden, on the other hand, feels, I think, deeply the values fundamentals of the alliance with Europe. And he has a history of work over the past 30 plus years to demonstrate that. And his foreign policy team is stronger on Europe than the Obama foreign policy team. So there will be a moment and a window if Biden comes in to address these problems. I think they will not be skeptical about the EU. They will want to build ties with the EU, pro-NATO. They're not going to be zero-sum in terms of NATO versus the EU. I think they will be creative about dealing with issues like dark money, corruption, occult investment. They will be creative on issues of supply chains. And by the way, I suspect that will work to Central Europe's advantage. If you're moving supply chains from autocratic regimes to more reliable countries, Central Europe is a good place to locate a lot of them. So I see some upside potential. I may be accused of excessive American optimism, but I still have the instincts of a policymaker always looking for opportunities rather than looking for the dark side of which there is plenty. Anyway, Richard, that's a sort of sketch of what I had in mind, building on what Radek and Florence said.
All right, thank you, Dan. We really need some optimism. So we look forward to the outcome of the American elections, and of course, we are following the words, the pronunciations of Joe Biden on future policy and Poland, and it looks great to me, at least. All right, theoretically, to achieve effectiveness in humans' fight against the spread of virus, we should expect a coordinated effort of all international parties, theoretically. In practice, more and more countries focus on the national security only, and the major players are competing, treating the pandemic as a battleground to have an upper hand in political race. Vladimir Putin, for example, gave to the new supposed effective Russian vaccine a name Sputnik 5, what sounds like part of the space race in the 60s. Are we driving towards a new global power confrontation where not tanks or carriers, but IT and biochemistry will decide who's the winner? And are we ready for such challenge? Florence, if I may ask you first.
Yes, thank you. First, let me just briefly respond to Radek, because I think you're putting the cart before the horse. I don't think we will have ever enough money for defense without a conversation about strategy and resilience and autonomy in those terms. So I think you're looking in the wrong place, which makes sense because it's also part of your job to generate that money. But before Europeans don't understand that security is their responsibility, not American responsibility, that the southern and eastern neighborhood is their neighborhood first, we will never have the money. And that's why I welcome this debate. I share your frustration that we're not where we should be and we could be a lot further. I mean, I work on the Middle East. I have seen for the last 15 years, one war after another where the Europeans issued just declarations. But that's exactly because of those last 15 years that I can see a change. I can see a change in quality. I can see a fear. I can see that now that even trade is affected, that trade is becoming a security issue, finally, some things are changing. Again, not as fast perhaps as we need, but at least something is changing. And Dan, by the way, I thought it was really funny what you said about these numbers. I think this competition over numbers, looking at who's going to win the COVID race depending on tests and positive tests and whatever. It's like running the Olympics without anybody testing for illegal substances. I mean, the Russians are not doing any testing, and if they're doing any testing, then they're falsifying the results. So I really would like our media to stop comparing these completely ludicrous numbers. But to your question, are we ready? So the thing is that we are actually readier than people think when it comes to AI. China spends a lot on AI, but in terms of research and development, Europe is second to the United States. Again, we could do a lot more and we should, but it's just not true that we are far, far left behind. I think really there's a little bit of European chronic pessimism when it comes to wherever we are in the world. The other thing is, I think something that people really overlook is that yes, states have looked out for their own citizens first. And honestly, I would like my state to watch out for me first when it comes to medical equipment. But on the one hand, I think Europe has caught up, has recovered from this initial nationalist instinct at the beginning of the crisis. But the second thing is, and really this story has to be told, never in the world have states cooperated as much on medical matters when it comes to COVID-19. I mean, I can share a paper with you that we have written on this, whether it comes to sharing of information, papers that are being put online. Why do you think we have so many vaccines already in the making, only, 9 months into the crisis? That's because we have a huge surge of cooperation, including between China and the United States, by the way. So I think really we should be careful not to make blank statements, and we're heading towards a world where everybody is locked down. I think we have severe geopolitical issues. I think for Europe, China's behavior during the crisis was a wake-up call. That's why I think we have, we're moving further back into the transatlantic area. And of course, we're hoping very much for Biden not to go back to where things were before, but to reinvent transatlantic relations with a more resilient, and I would hope so also more assertive Europe.
Okay, thank you. And it reminds me that your words about the Middle East, when we just gave some special support to appoint a new envoy for the Middle East problems from the European Union. Radek probably remembers it, and nothing came out of it. And of course, it provokes kind of a frustration that nothing good can be done. But we trust your words. I mean, there's a lot of hope in what you said. Radek, what is your opinion about all that?
Well, let me first say that Florence and I don't really disagree. We just have a different starting point. We have already pledged ourselves to do defense in common and foreign policy in common. If you read, and I'm sure you have, but those who haven't, if you read, I think it's Article 25 of the Lisbon Treaty, it's unbelievably strong on how we should loyally support the High Rep in the conduct of foreign and defense policy. It's just that we are not honoring our own treaties. We're in breach again, just like we were in breach of Schengen and the Eurozone treaties. So this is why I'm not entirely convinced that it's serious. As regards technological competition, I hope you're right on AI, but I'm told that on quantum computing, by those who know, that Europe is not even in the game, that it's between the US in the private sector and China in the state sector. And it's a transformational technology because whoever makes a working quantum computer first will break all existing ciphers, with unbelievable consequences for our banking system and for the secrecy of our security systems. So this is one to watch. And let me finish by agreeing with Dan that there are some silver linings. One of them, I hope, is that the United States breaks the political deadlock, that the corona crisis finally gets American politicians to fix America's problems, with investments where they are needed, with dealing with social inequalities and remaking the United States. But there is another silver lining that I'm looking forward to. You know, the clash of civilizations that was predicted, I see as happening within our own societies. In Poland, for example, we have a society that is split down the middle between a sort of enlightenment part of the population that looks to science and international solutions and rule of law and all that, and a sort of neo-medievalism, which looks to magic solutions and therefore believes populists when they offer simple cures for difficult problems. And the pandemic means that the two methods are being tested. And guess what? Magic doesn't work, whereas science actually is beginning to work. And so I hope that this accelerates some of the social transformations and makes millions of people aware of what works and what doesn't. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I must say, responding to what Radek just said, that we made a big error with the educational system. Something because I'm a veteran teacher, a university professor, and for many years I abandoned teaching at the university. Now I see the results, and the disaster in education generally provoked probably a part of these process that Radek just described. Sorry, Florence, I noticed your question or your request delayed. Are you still ready, or you want to, just sorry for that. I was just so focused on the screen, I didn't notice your request on the side. Dan, your turn, please.
Well, on the subject of internal divisions, the American equivalent of the split that Radek described is the perennial American split between Abraham Lincoln's vision of the country, rooted in the Declaration of Independence, that all are created equal, and meaning it. And let me say, John C. Calhoun's vision of America, he was the great ideologist of slavery and the Confederacy, a belief that America is essentially a white man's republic. And by the way, the Confederacy, by chance, adopted the kind of view of government that Poland had in the early 18th century, that is private wealth and public poverty. A weak state, no, as the saying used to go, za króla sasa jedź pij popuszczaj pasa. The starvation of the public sector lies at the root of many of America's social problems. And I share Radek's hope that the current election will allow a political breakthrough, and we Americans will start to deal with our problems in a sound way. Now, on the bright side, American history looks a lot better in retrospect, some golden age up until Trump, than it did at the time. We have periodically had wretched periods. The systemic racism of the 1920s, the bigoted isolationism of the 1930s, no need to tell Poles where that led. The incompetence of Iraq, well, how about the Vietnam War? Okay? My point is not that America is bad, but that we cannot retrospectively shine a halo around American history. We tend to mess up and then recover. It's the and then recover part that we're missing right now. We will have an opportunity, and we Americans will be able to deal, I suspect, in a Biden administration with a Europe and with a NATO under conditions where there is tremendous political capital and will to get it right, to pull ourselves together. Moreover, in historical terms, I understand the argument that China is pulling ahead, but every time I hear it, I keep recalling the learned and well-documented arguments demonstrating that the Soviet economy was forging ahead and they would be superior. I mean, what nonsense, but a lot of Americans actually believe that up to and in, through the mid-1980s. Drawing on an American intellectual tradition of declinism and some view that autocracies and tyrannies may be bad, but they were somehow efficient. So I don't want to be over-optimistic, but to say that looking darkly at the present is an old American and in fact Western habit. And to something Florence said, I want to emphasize, the EU has done better than the doomsayers predicted, like by a lot. Remember, coronavirus was supposed to be the death knell and Europe would fall apart. And if they couldn't fix the European economy during the debt crisis, they certainly weren't going to do it now, but they did. Real leadership came from France and Germany, and I suspect the potential is there for more. Anyway, that is my my attempt at looking on the bright side.
Yeah, thank you, Dan, for your words. I still remember when I was posted in Madrid during the one of the deepest economic crisis, financial crisis. And on Monday, all media were announcing or asking a question whether the European Union will survive till Wednesday, and it still exists. So it's good to remember that the bad experiences were not that difficult to overcome if people are together, and if we still believe that free individuals are more creative than those who are living without the freedom. That's the fundamental. And the last question, if I may, although you're very creative, so you jumped on some of my questions that I prepared. I'm very happy about it. It makes our discussion much more alive. During recent years, the famous unity of NATO was the biggest worry of its members. It is widely reported that some countries are using COVID-19 as an excuse to tighten the grip on their free societies and break the rule of law. Washington Treaty directly refers to these issues. They say rule of law, free society, democracy. Sharing financial burden, we know it's correct, we should. What about the common values? How do you see the problem? Will NATO also raise the problem of shattering the rule of law in some countries? Florence? I know that
it's a tricky question.
This is not about the European Union, actually.
No, but it concerns the EU even more, I would say. I mean, you know, we wrote a report for the EU. The EU has a foresight network called Espace, where a lot of the EU institutions are a member of. I wrote the report on their behalf. And we noted, you know, the point that Radek made earlier, that institutions should protect the rule of law from, you know, potential populists coming to power, and so that, you know, that the democratic system can survive the tenure of a populist in power. And we warned of that. And of course, you know, it's once you are in power, you can undo these things. So, you know, we see the problem that we see in Poland. We also see it in France. I mean, I saw this morning that I think 26% of French people would vote for Donald Trump, which are pretty much the same people probably that would vote for Marine Le Pen. We have equally concerning numbers in Italy, in Germany, and so forth. You know, the problem with that is that we don't really understand how to turn that around. And I think this is where our weakness is even more pronounced than when it comes to defense spending or other issues, because it's inside our societies. And for all the talk of Russia, in particular, but also China taking advantage of these divisions, they didn't create those divisions. They fuel them. They thrive on them. But how do we bring these two halves of societies, or several halves in some cases, back together? I think that is the real challenge. And in that sense, I'm happy that I work on foreign policy, not on domestic policy, because I honestly don't have an answer to that. I think it's a combination of geopolitical changes, of technological changes, economic changes. You know, the next industrial revolution is around the corner. Values within society are changing faster than some people can absorb. So if we haven't understood the problem fully, I think we cannot fully propose a solution. But I think that is exactly like Radek said, that is actually the real challenge of our time. It might not be China, it might be ourselves.
Thank you. I've been reading and I'm following the Pew Research polls and day job, and it looks frankly that more Europeans would vote for Xi or Putin than for Trump, actually. He's the less popular leader, world leader among the three guys. So I'm not, pardon?
Great.
Yes, but it looks like that. It looks like that. It sounds absurd, but it's it's a serious research done on in many countries. So she is more popular, or Putin, than the American president. It's also striking me. Radek, what you would like to say on this issue that, well, NATO is also the values. It's European Union sounds pretty vocal on that.
I think it's less of a problem for NATO, because NATO used to have non-democracy within its midst. And you can imagine a military alliance between democracies and non-democracies. In fact, Second World War was won by democracies with the help of another genocidal maniac. It's a bigger problem for the European Union. And whereas for some of you, it may be a philosophical problem or a political one, for me, it's a practical problem, because I will have to vote on whether the 750 billion recovery fund and the 1 trillion European multi-annual budget has or has not provisions that might stop funds to countries that are ruled to be in breach of the rule of law provisions of the Lisbon Treaty. And this is a difficult dilemma, because I think that it's those who break the rule of law that harm their country and are perhaps guilty of risking those funds. But of course, we know that propaganda in Hungary and Poland will make a mincemeat of people who support such a motion, because autocracies or autocratically minded politicians are very good at manipulating tribal emotions. And so it's a really difficult issue for us to deal with. And we need to at least prepare our public opinion for the notion that if you're for rule of law, you're not anti-Polish. Controversial. But I don't see another method of making our authorities think twice before, first subjugating the prosecution service, then the judiciary, and now even they're trying even to scare lawyers. And they're planning an assault on private media, having taken over public media. And the European Union should not be a cash machine for autocrats and thieves. Really difficult one, and I don't know how to resolve it.
Yeah, this is a practical problem that many people in Poland who are engaged and defending the democracy are thinking about, that this notion of being Polish and patriotic may be in conflict with the fact that we want a return to sort of democracy that we had, that we were proud of.
One idea that I hope will prevail is that the money would not be lost. It would just be frozen until the rule of law breach is corrected, or that the money could still go to farmers and regional and local authorities, but not to the central government that is doing the breach of the rule of law. Those, I think, are two good ideas. If they could be enforced, would resolve the dilemma.
Yeah, thank you, Radek, again. And Dan, please, the screen is yours.
What can I say on the issue of rule of law when President Trump in his campaign rallies all weekend was calling for his opponent to be locked up, to be jailed? I know in my former role as diplomat, if an incumbent president in a country I was serving in called for his opponent to be locked up, I know what kind of a diplomatic report I would send to Washington. And I mean hate the fact that the United States is generating material for similar reports from European diplomats back to Brussels and their home capitals. I mean, my God. The good news is that Trump seems poised to lose, perhaps decisively. I don't know that, but it is not a particularly proud moment for me as an American. What can I say on the issue of challenges to the rule of law elsewhere in Europe? I will say this, the Trump administration policy toward Poland and toward Central Europe has been constructive. I've supported most of it. The motives of that policy have been mixed. I think Trump likes Poland and Hungary, not always for reasons which I share. I also think that Trump has exaggerated the degree to which Poland is anti-European or nationalist. That may or may not be true with respect to Hungary. I don't think it's true with respect to Poland. And I will say that as far as I know, and I have reasons for this belief, President Duda has handled Trump rather skillfully. And I want to give him credit. All that said, the Biden people are serious about the rule of law. Biden's good written statement about support for Poland is accurate. And the last tick of that statement refers to the importance of the rule of law. The Biden people, and I'm not part of the Biden team, but the Biden people are more sophisticated about Central Europe than you'd think, if you just read some of the ill-considered statements that have been made. They know they know what's going on, and I hope that Radek is wrong in his prediction of a hardline Nagonka-like turn by the current Polish government. They don't need that, for God's sake. Duda won an election. I don't see what is to be gained by going after private media or a new round of hard right initiatives. They don't need that. They won with an election. They won 2 elections without it. But they're not asking my advice. Anyway, the politics in Poland and the United States is divided. Emotions are high. These are complicated issues. And Radek, with respect to the dilemma you face, I wish you the best. We've all got our problems to solve, but I will, as Jan Nowak used to say, in similar difficult circumstances, jeszcze Polska nie zginęła.
Dan, if I may be helpful to you, I think when President Trump calls for Biden to be locked up, that might be projection of what he fears for himself. He has apparently already said that he might have to leave the country. If he loses, I bet you he will look for a country that doesn't have an extradition treaty with the United States. And here's a prediction. He'll end up in a really nasty nouveau riche villa in the Crimea.
Well, projection is something we have become accustomed to with respect to Donald Trump. So yeah, I agree. And I suppose offline we could start a pool as to possible places of exile. But there's an election yet, 2 weeks plus to go, and we shall see how it turns out.
All right, thank you. I'm afraid I don't have the access to the YouTube chat, and there are probably questions that I don't see them. I cannot ask you the questions that are coming from the public. I have only the chat that is here among the participants. I don't know if anybody can help me with that, but if not, we have a very little time left, and avoiding the predictions, because I'm very bad with that. So any prediction I did in the past, they ruined me later. It was all against it. So I better abstain from saying who and how, when, and what will happen with Donald Trump if he loses. But instead of that, let me ask you shortly, perhaps it would clear up a little bit our picture. If you name just 3 biggest challenges for the European Union, Florence, and global challenges that the NATO will confront in the next future, could you name it just 3 items without developing bigger ideas? I know that you can, just to finish nicely our great encounter. Florence.
Just 3, because I feel like I'll have, I need at least a list of 10. Okay, just 3. So I think obviously, I'm going to cheat a bit. I'm going to say the pandemic, it's so obvious, so it doesn't count. I would say beyond the economic recovery that's tied to the pandemic, I would say that geopolitical challenges, the first challenge is, of course, inside, what we just said, healing our own societies or finding a middle ground where we can talk to each other without killing each other. I think the second thing is, of course, climate change. We have kind of forgotten about it because all the other issues are more pressing. but climate change is still ongoing. And the short reprieve we have because of COVID will not save us from turning things around. And I think lastly, it's what I said in the beginning. I think for Europe, the real challenge is to understand who it wants to be in the future. What will be its contribution to the world? And I'm sorry, it cannot just be rule of law and good governance. It has to stand and fend for itself. And that is, I think, a challenge that it will have to take up. Otherwise, there is a real risk that will become the Switzerland of the world. Nice to visit, but ultimately not important.
Yeah, thank you. And I agree with you totally. And let me add that, or remind you that education. We made a great reform in Europe, but it looks like it's not. It's not shaped properly for the contemporary challenges. I'm telling you from my practice, from my ongoing experience, everyday meetings with the young people, that they are not prepared for what's coming. Radek, what is your opinion about perhaps a little bit more globally than only the European?
Well, let me start by saying that I believe Europe should become a Switzerland, but with nukes and without the neutrality. And we should learn from the Swiss experience of moving from a confederation to a federation, a multilingual federation. There's a great deal to be learned. But on challenges, I would say three. First of all, the still overhang of a possible return to mass migration from Northern Africa and the Middle East that has the potential, as even Krastev has written, to destroy the European Union via the political process, via the rise of national populists. Secondly, revisionist Russia and everything that she does on our periphery and inside our politics again. And third, that the Americans mismanage their great power rivalry with China. And in particular, if the Chinese try to unify, as they say, with Taiwan by force, that could draw away all American energies and resources away from Europe. And that, of course, would be a huge challenge for us. Thank you.
Thank you. And just before that, I give you your time. You said some words about the Obama administration. I had the honor to serve during the Obama administration second term in Washington, and frankly, the concept, the idea of the alliance, or better said, the Trans-Pacific trade agreement with Asian countries, which was frustrated. So this was probably the first one which was crossed out by Donald Trump when he took the office. But it was reasonable. I mean, to get more free trade and to get closer to build up the ties with the remaining Asian countries. Even if the Europeans felt at that time a little bit abandoned, it is important, and we see that now. What do you think about it?
I put your question in a more general term. That is, I think a priority of a Biden administration should be to strengthen the core of the global democratic community. That means transatlantic and trans-Pacific. Obama's pivot to Asia suggested we were pivoting away from Europe. That was dumb. What we should be doing is working with Europe and key Asian allies, Japan, Korea, Australia, India, Taiwan to some degree, right? The core democracies, which if you add them up, bring together, well over 50%. I mean, now you're talking, you're getting there to 60%, verging on 2/3 of the global economy. And if you add up the regulatory power of the US and Europe combined, because EU is awfully good at regulations, then we have the ability to set 21st century terms of trade, technology, transparency, and have the Chinese come to us rather than have them set to. That is a big deal. So that's, it's not just trade and TPP, it's whether or not the free world, and I use the term deliberately, attempts to keep setting the rules in the 21st century, or whether we allow the autocracies to start setting the rules, which I think would be a spectacularly bad idea. Bring the democracies together, the better to deal with the despots.
Okay, I got here one question which was transferred from YouTube, but I understand we've been talking about a pandemic coronavirus that is giving great opportunity to develop autocratic rules and governing by autocrats and undemocratic governments. How can we deal with that? We've been talking about, I mentioned that the rule of law under the pandemic stress is in danger. So I think we are coming to the end. I don't know how much the public, but I personally enjoyed meeting you all, Florence, Radek, and Dan. And thank you very much for your participation. Hope to see you again soon. And please, it is to the public and other people, stay tuned. We will kick off the next session in a few minutes. Okay, thank you so much.
Bye.
Hello, good afternoon. Welcome back. I hope you are with us It has been a while. We are discussing today NATO, and this panel will be on transatlantic relations. My name is Małgorzata Bonikowska. I am the president of the Center for International Relations, one of the oldest Polish independent think tanks. We cooperate with our friends from Cracow, so thank you for having me on this panel. The title is precisely Transatlantic Ties. Are they strong enough to guarantee NATO's security initiatives after the pandemic is over? And I will ask this question, and this topic to our panelists, prestigious diplomats and scholars. We are lucky enough to have two extremely experienced diplomats, one from the US, one from Germany, and one scholar from Poland. So let me introduce our speakers first. Rolf Nickel. Hi, Rolf.
Hi.
Thanks for being with us. I don't need to present this person to the Polish audience because Rolf has just been the German ambassador to Poland since, I think, 2014. And
right.
And
exactly.
Yes, ended. So it was really extremely good job you've done here. But Rolf is a very experienced diplomat. He was serving in different positions in different German embassies all over the world, Russia, Moscow included. And now he is vice president in a think tank, prestigious think tank, German Council for Foreign Relations. Then we have Alexander Vergeboe, also very experienced diplomat. Alexander, are you with us? Yes. Well, I don't know from where to start. The list of your achievements is so long. So I just mentioned maybe that he was Deputy Secretary General to NATO. And today he's in Atlantic Council, very well known to the Polish audience as well, a think tank. But he served in several diplomatic positions of the United States. He was ambassador to South Korea. He was ambassador to Russia, and he was also the American ambassador to NATO. So thank you for being with us. And finally, Dr. Wojciech Michnik. Hello, Wojtek.
Hi, good afternoon. How are you?
Thanks for being with us. Dr. Michnik is from the Jagiellonian University, Krakow, but he specializes in security matters, and he was also a scholar, Fulbright scholar at United States, and recently at Rome Defense College, NATO Defense College, recently last year on the Eisenhower scholarship. So, gentlemen, I would start from quoting certain interesting statements we've just heard in the previous panel. I think they just give us a good starting point. We had a statement from Radek Sikorski that the European ambition of being independent in security matters is a little bit vague because there's no money for this. We are not really spending enough to have strategic autonomy. And Dr. Florence Gaub from Paris, she says that we can feel in Europe this strategic loneliness, meaning that the United States are not anymore so close to us. However, we can hope for the Biden's administration to maybe change it. And Danfried said that definitely the Biden's administration will be much stronger about Europe, especially if you compare it to Obama administration. And we can count on, if Biden wins, on some better understanding between the US and the EU, also in the sector of security. But we have to agree, I think, on one thing. There is this kind of let's call it Trump effect in Europe. And I think it will not disappear. First of all, we don't have trust. I think trust is the word to be used here. We cannot really fully trust on the US today. And this is also connected with a strong anti-American sentiment in many of the European countries, maybe not in Poland, but definitely in some countries of the Western Europe, definitely in France, definitely in Italy. So I think this can also have an impact on our future relations. And finally, we definitely have a China-US rivalry, which is putting a lot of questions to the EU and to Europe as a continent, how to position ourselves. And it seems that the European Union doesn't like to be pushed by the Americans too hard to choose between these two. And it's also true what Radek Sikorski mentioned, that out of 3 leaders, when we take Donald Trump, when we take Xi Jinping, and when we take Vladimir Putin, Trump is really on the bottom of this list in the opinion of the European citizens. So this is not a very promising start to discuss transatlantic ties. But this will be my first question to each of you, but also I would like to hear now, we would like to hear now your initial statement. So maybe we can start from Rolf.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you very much, Małgorzata. Thank you very much to all the other speakers for having me for this timely conference. I think it's great to have it. It's great to be back on track again with some of the good old friends. I'm particularly heartened also to see Sandy Vergeboe. And I just learned recently that he was, like myself a couple of years ago, playing in a band called Coalition of the Willing. So our band had a different name, but we played also band, and I hope we'll have some sort of Coalition of the Willing in the debate today. There are 2 essential points I want to make. The first one is about the pandemic. I think globally, the pandemic has not changed the security architecture as such, but will probably reinforce and catalyze already existing trends. We are in the middle of the second wave. We don't know where we'll end up. Political consequence, health, economic and political consequences are still very much open. And we have to see how we get out of it. But what one can already see is that the US-China antagonism is increasing. On the surface, we see a war of words. China denies its responsibility for the outbreak of the virus, and the question who gets out of our pandemic first with least consequences is a powerful argument in the systemic rivalry discussions. Digging deeper, it's obviously the question about the power in the Indo-Pacific region between the #1 power and the rising power, China. China is challenging all our common values and interests in the transatlantic community as well as in the trans-Pacific community. And already under Obama, America's pivot to Asia and US attention is focusing much more on the Asian theater. This trend is increasing. Without falling into the trap of Thucydides, the region may very well be the primary center of conflict in the 21st century. The consequences for Europe are not entirely clear and will depend to a certain degree on the outcome of the US election. But even if with the Biden administration, more will be asked from us Europeans, there is no question in my mind. China seems to have gotten out of the pandemic relatively well and is giving a push to the global economy at the moment. Whether this will change the attitude of some governments towards Beijing remains to be seen. And pushing back on China economically is more difficult, obviously, in times of pandemic and economic problems. Second point in this context about the pandemic is the pandemic pushes the development of digitization. More and more people work from their home office, a trend that will not be easily pushed back once the pandemic is over. Our economies become increasingly dependent on the well-functioning of digital infrastructure and systems. Hence, there is an increased danger from cyber attacks, cyber thefts, and cyber espionage. We need to protect ourselves better against these types of attacks, particularly when they target critical infrastructure. This is obvious. Third point in this context, money. There is a risk deriving from changed priorities of governments. Fighting the pandemic is a very costly affair and is still open-ended. All allies and the EU have mobilized unprecedented funds to counter the deflationary effect of the pandemic. Most countries have encouraged larger deficits, sometimes on the basis of already existing huge deficits. So far, in most cases, military spending has not been affected. But what will happen when governments have to cut back on their expenditures because of pressing financial problems? What will happen to our targets in terms of cash, contributions, and capabilities? The problem is compounded by the fact, for example, between now and 2030 in Germany, 12 million people will leave the workforce and only 5 million will enter it. There will be a huge competition for spending on security and social purposes. Fourth point on this one, some countries use the pandemic to advance their goals in terms of more control of society or as a cover for foreign policy adventures. Would the fight for Nagorno-Karabakh have happened without the pandemic? Would the poisoning of Navalny have happened without Corona? Would Lukashenko have clamped down on protesters against the rigged election in the same way if he did not think that the West was somehow distracted by the management of the crisis? These may all be miscalculations on the part of these leaders, but international stability in the end is negatively affected. And there is also, of course, the danger that some countries may deflect attention from their mismanagement of the crisis by a more aggressive foreign policy. This may be particularly true if health issues come on top of other economic problems. It may increase the willingness by some to act in aggressive ways internally and abroad. So we have to be very much on our guards. Fifth point in this context, even though COVID-19 is a severe test for each government, the EU, for the time being, in my view, drew the right conclusions. In the beginning of the pandemic, the general feeling was everybody for himself. Then it became obvious that this attitude did not lead anywhere. Member states realized that fighting the pandemic together made them stronger than before. And with respect to the economic consequences, the EU presented an unprecedented recovery fund together with a budget to the amount of 1.8 trillion euro. So COVID-19 may well have given European integration a decisive push forward. Now, coming to my second point, I would argue that transatlantic ties are strong enough to guarantee NATO security initiatives. Despite some recent quarreling, transatlantic ties are still fundamentally strong, very strong. Europe and America are tied together by a common bond of values, interests, and shared history after 1945. This bond will not be broken by the pandemic, and NATO is strong enough to resist. Of course, our alliance is an adaptation process. It concerns a number of military and political issues. The reflection process underway under the authority of the Secretary General is one element of this process. It may lead to a new strategic concept reflecting new realities of an increased geopolitical rivalry. And personality matters. The upcoming US election will be of crucial importance for Europe as a whole. Next year, Chancellor Merkel will have left the political scene in Germany after 16 years in power. Slightly more than 2 weeks before November 3, it does not make much sense for a European to speculate who is going to win, particularly since this is not only a presidential but also a congressional election. Even from a foreign policy standpoint, it is not completely unimportant who will carry the Senate. So it would be preposterous from my side to discuss the differences between the candidates. I leave that to Sandy Vergeboe and others. Let me rather talk about our expectations for this election. Whatever the result of the election, there will not be, in my view, a going back to the status quo ante. We will have to deal with an America much more focused on Asia and specifically China. We need to be more united vis-a-vis the China challenge. For Europe, China is a partner, an economic competitor, and a systemic rival. We need to manage this relationship together. Second point, NATO is at the heart of our common security, and Europe, specifically Germany, Europe and specifically Germany needs to do more. At the same time, we hope that in the end of a second Trump administration, the president will not come back to what John Bolton reported in his book, on his intentions in 2018, i.e. a merry exit. Europe needs to get its act together and be a real global partner for real America, not only in Europe. That means getting more capable to act in foreign policy, including via qualified majority in the EU. A stronger NATO needs a stronger Europe. Europe needs to do more rather than less, including in NATO. It gets difficult when we talk about an operational role for NATO, for example, in the Indo-Pacific. Thirdly, as a corollary, we expect America to continue to support our integration process. This has been a really weak point under the Trump administration. Extraterritorial sanctions against allies is a no-go. They weaken us all. Fourthly, we expect the double-track approach towards Russia adopted in Wales and Warsaw to be further implemented. There is no need for a fundamental change in our posture towards Russia. It is interesting to see how the debate between the Guatemala group and the group around David Kramer in the US will develop. Fifthly, START is expiring in early February 2021. The recent positive noises about high-level contacts between the US and Russia and the Billingsley-Ryabkov talks in Geneva, we expect an extension of the START treaty, making space for the negotiation of a new nuclear arms accord. I hope we are not deceived. Sixth, with a possible Biden administration, we expect the US to come back to the Paris Climate Agreement and to the nuclear deal with Iran, creating new avenues for cooperation. Also, we expect certainly more multilateral America, possibly with new summits for democracy and the reconfiguration of the G7. We do not expect trade issues between the US and Europe to subside. Maybe the tone may be a little bit more friendlier. In conclusion, I would say that in uncertain times of increasing big state competition, NATO still constitutes the bedrock of our common security. It needs to be strengthened rather than weakened. NATO is a military alliance that is also a forum for political dialogue among allies about common challenges. We need to use both in this spirit. Thank you.
Thank you, Rolf. This was Rolf Nickel, and the position was, I would presume, basically from the European point of view. And now let's move to the US. And Alexander, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Małgorzata, and thanks very much to Anna Klich and the Institute of Strategic Studies for inviting me back to Krakow, even if it's virtual. It's been one of my favorite conferences over the years, and I look forward perhaps to having a rock and roll jam session with Rolf Nickel when we're back in Krakow in a physical sense. The coronavirus has obviously delivered a huge shock to the international system, but I would agree with all those who have said that it hasn't yet brought down that system, but rather accelerated some of the worrisome trends that were already underway before the pandemic. Most importantly, the rise of China as a global power and intensified US-Chinese competition. But we're also seeing a declining Russia that may become even more dangerous with its revisionist ambitions and its determination to both subjugate its neighbors and undermine our democracies. And combined with that are the social trends, the retreat from globalization, the rise of nationalism, protectionism, and xenophobia in many of our societies, along with the erosion of public support for multilateral cooperation, just to name a few of the problems. But I think beyond this, the pandemic has given the international community a preview, perhaps a frightening preview, of what a world without US leadership looks like. It's highlighted the difficulty of rebuilding and sustaining multilateral cooperation when the US chair is empty and there is no clear alternative to fill the leadership vacuum. China has tried to take advantage by asserting a stronger role in global governance and promoting the alleged superiority of its authoritarian system. But its heavy-handed bullying is antagonizing other powers who are reluctant to follow Beijing's lead. Europe has improved its internal cooperation in responding to the pandemic after a rough start, and it has taken historic decisions to mitigate the economic impact. but it pains me to say that the European Union, despite its talk of it becoming more geopolitical, is still a relative political and military lightweight, not capable of filling the United States' shoes, certainly not by itself. So for me, the inescapable conclusion is that the world still needs the combined strength of the United States and Europe to protect and strengthen the international order. Only with renewed US-European leadership, working together with leading democracies outside of Europe, can we hope to reinvigorate multinational cooperation to deal with the effects of the pandemic and with the many other future challenges the world is facing or will be facing in the coming years. Now, I don't have to run through all the factors that have led to this increasing estrangement between the two sides of the Atlantic over the past few years. But on security, President Trump has threatened to pull out of NATO, and he clearly views other multilateral institutions with suspicion, even declaring the European Union to be an enemy of the United States. He's withdrawn troops from coalition operations in Syria and Afghanistan without consulting allies who have troops on the ground, prompting President Macron's famous charge that NATO is becoming brain dead. So meeting the multiple challenges and restoring cooperation and particularly trust to underpin that will obviously be harder if Trump is reelected and there are fewer adults in the room to curb his worst instincts. Now, it's not inevitable, but I fear that another 4 years of Trump could make some of the damage we've seen in the last few years, which I think is temporary, it could become more irreversible. A Biden victory will certainly bring the restoration of a more traditional US approach to the world and a recommitment to NATO and multilateralism more generally. But I should warn Europeans that they shouldn't be naive that we're just going to kind of rewind back to where we left off 4 years ago and go back to the good old days. Now, yes, Biden is a committed Atlanticist in his bones, but his administration will be under pressure to give priority to economic recovery from the pandemic and healing the many other domestic wounds that Trump will leave in his wake. So this could mean a further scaling back of US international commitments, continuing the retrenchment that began not with Trump, but actually with Obama, and has just been continuing under the current president. And in fact, this point has been made before, but key factor is that both political parties in the United States consider China as the #1 priority now in our foreign and security policy. And I think that whoever wins, the next US administration will look to the European allies, not only to help in managing the China challenge, but also to assume a greater defense burden in Europe's immediate neighborhood, whether they're ready or not. And in my view, this, however, should not be viewed as a threat, but as an opportunity by the European allies, a chance to agree on a renewed, more balanced transatlantic partnership for the post-pandemic era. Now, this more balanced partnership needs to be reflected in many institutions, not just in NATO, but NATO is the right place to begin. NATO has weathered the Trump storm better than other transatlantic institutions and has already engaged in the reflection process, the NATO 2030 process, aimed at strengthening the political dimension of the alliance. I was pleased to hear Secretary General Stoltenberg say a few days ago that this could now be broadened into a full-fledged review of the strategic concept, which hasn't been changed since 2010 when Russia was still our partner and China was hardly ever mentioned in alliance debates. So an update is long overdue in my view. But it shouldn't just be a bureaucratic exercise. It's a real opportunity to define a new transatlantic security agenda for the post-pandemic era. We could go through a long list of items on the military side, but I think that will be the focus of the next panel. I would cite 3 top priorities. The list is longer, but I'll give you my top 3. First of all, we need a new transatlantic bargain on burden sharing. We need to move beyond today's narrow focus on defense spending and aim for a fundamentally more balanced partnership. And specifically, by 2030, the European allies should aim as much as possible to contribute 50% of some of the critical capabilities and enablers now provided mainly, if not exclusively, by the United States. Things like heavy lift, aerial refueling, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. This would equip them to serve as the first responder to most crises in Europe's neighborhood without depending so much on direct US support. And I think operations could be carried out under the NATO flag or the EU flag, but in either case, drawing on NATO planning and command structures. I'd like to go back to the Berlin Plus model and stop talking about strategic autonomy. Europeans could also take the lead on NATO's partnership and training programs with the Middle Eastern neighbors, which now are woefully underfunded, and perhaps merging these efforts with those of the European Union. The bottom line is that with Europe taking the lead in its own neighborhood, the US could focus primarily on Article 5 responsibilities and shift some of its military assets, as will inevitably be necessary, from Europe to the Asia-Pacific theater, and to do so without weakening deterrence against Russia. Now, second, allies need to work with the United States to develop a transatlantic strategy for dealing with China. And I think it doesn't have to be global. It could focus first and foremost on the risks to European security, which are many. I know allies don't want to get in the middle of a US-Chinese confrontation, but they should recognize that many aspects of Chinese behavior that affect Europe can be best dealt with by presenting a united transatlantic framework. The natural forum, NATO is a natural forum to share intelligence on China and to set policy on immediate security risks like protecting 5G networks, protecting transportation infrastructure and medical supply chains. And I think NATO is a good forum for discussing how to deal with China on arms control. The agenda could grow over time with NATO working ever more closely with the European Union to address issues like the Belt and Road Initiative and Chinese activism in the Arctic. And I think NATO could even expand its outreach to other democracies. It has Asia-Pacific partners who are only rarely consulted. By bringing them into a wider circle, we would increase our leverage for influencing Chinese behavior and encouraging Beijing to pursue cooperation rather than competition on transnational issues. Now, lastly, here I might disagree slightly with Rolf. I think NATO needs a more dynamic approach to Russia. Yes, the two-track strategy is a mantra that has held everybody together, but I don't think we've been effective in actually countering Moscow's political warfare against our societies and against our values. We're largely in a largely static and reactive mode with little meaningful dialogue in the NATO-Russia Council, continued Russian provocative military activities on our air and sea space, aggressive disinformation and propaganda, and continued adventurism in the Middle East and Africa. But I'm not suggesting another reset, which would just embolden Putin. I think we need a more robust two-track strategy. On the one hand, doing more to raise the costs for Moscow's disruptive activities, pushing back more forcefully on disinformation and cyber threats, increasing the pressure on Russia to end its efforts to subjugate Ukraine and other neighbors. At the same time, NATO need not be so fearful of dialogue as has been the case for the last 6 years. We need to take the diplomatic offensive to limit nuclear and conventional arms and negotiate measures to reduce the risks of military incidents. And at the end of the day, managing the competition with Russia may be the best we can do in the short term. But I think allies also have to be sure that they stick to their principles until Russia is once again ready to comply with the rules that it accepted, even help write those rules in the Helsinki Final Act and the NATO-Russia Founding Act. So those are my top 3 priorities. All of this may sound a little ambitious, but I like that expression, don't waste a crisis. It's time for European allies to step up in forging a more equal transatlantic partnership with the United States. And it's time for the United States to welcome this with less ambivalence. The United States needs a stronger Europe that can take more responsibility in its near abroad while continuing to work with the United States to address the challenges from China and Russia. I think this kind of more dynamic agenda would also demonstrate to our citizens that the alliance remains relevant in addressing their most pressing security concerns. And by working together on the security agenda, I think the transatlantic community could also show the way to ensuring that the pandemic is a catalyst for renewed international cooperation in meeting the challenge of future pandemics and all the other global challenges that we face. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Alexander, and especially I'm grateful that you ended on a rather positive note. Let's not waste any crisis. So before we move to the discussion, let's end up this round of speeches by Wojciech Michnik. Wojciech, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and I'm delighted to be in such a distinguished panel. You both already touched upon most of the important issues. I will not waste your time or the audience, and I will just point where I actually slightly disagree or I have a different perspective on how the transatlantic ties are right now going. Since both of you seem to be optimistic, let me be a bit skeptical on some of the issues. So to answer the question that is in the title of the panel, I think the short answer is no. Transatlantic ties are not strong enough to guarantee NATO's security initiatives after the pandemic wave. That is exactly why those ties should be reinforced and they need to be renegotiated. And I will explain what do I mean by that. First of all, of course, when we think about transatlantic ties, we think NATO first, and that's normal. And I agree with this. And I'm less concerned about NATO as an institution, and I'm more concerned about, let's say, the broader state of transatlantic relations that have also bilateral dimensions, cultural dimensions. Personally, I just don't see how the future generation, let's say, of young people right now will cherish transatlantic ties the way the current generation or even former done it. And I think that should be also a concern of our debate. So I will attempt to explain what I mean by this in 3 points. I mean, first I'll just go back to the transatlantic ties and speak a little bit about NATO. Then I will go and jump to the NATO security initiatives, and I will highlight 2 that I think are the most dire of, let's say, discussing, and I will end up with just pointing towards the possible consequences for NATO that the pandemic has brought. And of course, when we talk about the consequences, we should be very careful because the crisis is not over, and we are actually still in the middle of it. So we are ahead of the curve, so to speak. So as far as NATO, of course, this has been said a couple of times today. Historically, NATO has always been in an adapting mode, trying to address security threats that are most daunting for given times. And I think that's an opportunity right now for NATO, but also it might be quite a challenge, especially that if we look back into, let's say, 2019, it was not the best year for, let's say, NATO unity. And we can talk about the transatlantic rift, about the brain dead comment. We can talk about the fallout from the Turkey decision to withdraw from Syria or buying S-400s, etc. We all know it that and it ended up with the London meeting. Even then, NATO was in a state of looking for a new strategic concept, looking for, like, if you will, soul searching. And then the pandemic came, and I would argue that pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, is probably the biggest crisis since the end of the Cold War, which means that it is probably bigger than 9/11, bigger than the Arab uprisings, and bigger than the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Of course, how NATO responds will define, the future of NATO as well. The second point, what are the NATO security initiatives, that we should be focused on? The first one that was already mentioned is, of course, deterrence and defense. The cornerstone of the alliance, and lately it was mostly, the deterrence of Russia. I agree that the dual track of deterrence and dialogue. I mean, even if it's, let's say, right as an approach, I don't think that at this moment is going, somewhere. Deterrence is working. That this part is fine, but as far as the dialogue is concerned, there are too many questions. What should we talk about with Russia? I mean, should we talk about them, withdrawing from Crimea? I don't think it's going to happen. Should we just, start business as usual, basically rewarding them for all the resurgent and aggressive behavior on the eastern flank, etc., etc. So I think that, as Ambassador said, we need to have much more strategic approach of what do we want from Russia, as a not necessary enemy, but as a very difficult competitor, that's number one. But at the same time, we have the whole idea of counterterrorism and countering so-called hybrid and cyber threats that the alliance is treating very seriously, and that's slightly different approach to the security environment right now. So kind of moving from the east flank, at least for the moment, we also need to understand what's on the south. I'm not going to discuss the NATO 360 approach because I don't think there's time and place for this, but what I would say that at some point we'll come back as NATO to the discussion about what is more important and can we actually combine the traditional approach to military security and all the non-military threats that are waiting on the horizon, and is NATO really equipped to fully address them? And of course, the short answer, I would say, not really. And that's why I think the cooperation with the European Union is so important, especially on the so-called soft threats and the issues that we can cooperate as organizations. So far there's been a lot of talk about the coming of this cooperation, but I would argue that in current situation we might be forced to rely on them in some respects. At the same time, I would agree with Minister Sikorski when he says that there is really no money in Europe to have this whole defense autonomy, even if it's the noble and great idea. I think we should be more realistic about what the taxpayers would like to spend money for, especially after the pandemic. So I will move to the last one, the third point. What are the kind of the direct consequences that we can see right now of the COVID-19 pandemic? I mean, the first one is obvious. It's the deep economic crisis, and the magnitude of this crisis, is not yet known to us, which means that for sure the NATO member states' military budgets will be affected. And I'm not talking only about the 2% threshold, but in general, there will be probably a bigger push within the NATO societies to spend on what we call human security, health security, etc., etc., which means that NATO might not be at some point be able to have the same budget that it has now. Well, the second point, the second consequences is, it would mean that NATO needs to balance military readiness, with expectations to address non-military threats. And the last one, the last consequence that I mentioned that also has been already discussed here is, the rise of nationalistic sentiments and the focus on the domestic issues. It was present before COVID-19 even started, but I think right now it just accelerated, and this is a dangerous threat that we should take a look very carefully. That at some point people will not be interested in international security. They will see only what's happening at their respective capitals. I will be happy to expand on some of those thoughts in the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Wojciech. Well, we have a lot of things on our plate, and you mentioned so many things. We have also questions from the audience. So before I move to these questions, I put myself two. First question, I want to ask you about Turkey, Greece, because we didn't really mention this, but it seems that this is really an important thing for NATO as well, because there are two NATO members who are now having an issue. And this is not only the problem for the southeastern neighborhood, but that influences also, as we've discovered, the situation with Belarus because of the Cyprus approach and the temptation to combine both the issues. So I just want, maybe I will start from Rolf and then I will ask Alexander and Wojtek. How do you see the consequences of these tensions we are facing right now for NATO? Rolf.
Well, first of all, is there an opportunity to react to some of this what had been said before? Then I would do this. Maybe do this at the end if we get a time for. On the question of Turkey and Greece first. I'm afraid to say, but this is not so much a problem Turkey and Greece, it's rather a problem of Turkey. And it's not limited, unfortunately, to the relationship with Greece. We see the actions that are happening in Nagorno-Karabakh, pushing the Azeris. We see it in Syria. We see it in Libya. Here we see it in the action with vis-a-vis the S-400 from Russia. So here is an ally who is sort of silently walking separate ways. And we must be quite clear and we must be very determined what to do here. Now, of course, Turkey is in a strategic region of the world, but I think the talks with Turkey on all these issues have to be very clear. And Mr. Erdogan's, unfortunately, probably inspired by domestic troubles, to engage in foreign policy adventures is a very worrying factor. And I think NATO really has something to say here, and we should be very clear on some of the issues that are touched here. On Belarus, maybe shortly, I think the European Union has taken the right decisions. We have sanctioned 40 officials for the rigging of the election. This is, I think, a good step forward. We should watch it very carefully. We should also support the civil society. There is talk about a plan, an economic plan to support civil society, which has been commissioned by the last European Council. So this is also very good. As NATO, I think we should stay clear of a geopolitical dimension of this, because this could only inflame things and could only lead to consequences that we are not really looking forward to.
Thank you, Rolf. And Alexander, what will be your answer?
Mm-hmm. These are very tough questions. I basically agree with what Rolf said on Belarus. I think even with all the problems of the Trump administration, I think it's been working reasonably well with the EU and with its EU partners in trying to find a course that doesn't give the Russians a pretext for escalation or a military intervention, but stays true to our values and insisting that there be a political process that can deal with the consequences of this rigged election. There may actually be some shared interest with Putin here, who may be looking for a way to ease Mr. Lukashenko out. We should, without necessarily approving of his methods, we might want to see whether we can steer him towards that outcome and see new elections organized. On the Greece-Turkey issues, these are quite difficult, and I can't resist saying that it was obviously a big mistake for the European Union to bring in Cyprus before there was an agreement on reunification. But that's ancient history now. But we're seeing.
But we all agree with you as far as this.
We're seeing some of the consequences. But clearly, Turkey is increasingly pursuing its own geopolitical agenda while relying on the NATO security guarantee to actually give it more freedom of maneuver rather than helping the rest of us. But I think the only solution, because NATO operates by consensus, is to try to work as much as possible in NATO forums and informally. I think the Secretary General has a big role to play in trying to mediate and tone down some of these disagreements. If we can find something to work more closely with Turkey on that is positive, such as steering Libya towards a real power sharing agreement, which would be good for denying the Russians a stronger foothold in Libya, then maybe we can build on that and defuse some of these other issues. But it's the hardest nut to crack. I remember spending a lot of time with the Turkish ambassador on many different problems as a troubleshooter, but didn't always find solutions to those troubles.
Well, the concern is obviously just to make NATO incapable to decide anything, because there are 2 NATO members. It's the same problem we are facing as far as the Security Council of the UN. So the situation is quite serious. Also the future of the decisions taken by the alliance. And Wojtek, what will be your answer? And then we'll move to the questions from the floor.
Sure. So I also agree on the Belarusian angle with both Mr. Ambassadors. I think that we should walk the fine line between, rejecting Lukashenko and the rigged election, at the same time supporting democratic movement in Belarus, but at the same time trying not to provoke, the Russian engagement. So this would be one point. The other would be, we as, at least as NATO, we can talk about EU as well, but we should also try to be much more resilient in terms of the countering Russian disinformation campaigns that are basically trying to convince some of the those who are willing to listen that Poland or some of the Eastern and Central European states are eager to threaten Belarusian independence, which is of course not true. As far as the Turkish-Greek situation, I think it's much more serious, than sometimes we like to admit, because Turkey is not going away in terms of their geopolitical ambitions, and they've been doing it for quite some time. They are a pivotal power in the region, and I think President Erdogan feels right now that he has an upper hand. Some of the Greeks, on the other hand, they really feel encircled, and one of the scenarios that they speak about is that they're afraid there will be some border skirmish that will lead to the even military confrontation, and even on the very minimal scale, it will be disastrous for NATO. So as long as the NATO is concerned, I think this should be one of the biggest priorities, to talk to both of them. And I also would agree that mostly, Ankara is the place to try to solve the problem, or at least diminish it. But it would require from NATO kind of the big negotiation skill, because Turkey will not give up all the ambitions. It will not cooperate on Libya, on Cyprus, on S-400s at the same time. I don't think it's going to happen. So I think this one is here to stay, and as far as the problems go. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Wojtek. And there is also one more aspect of this discussion. It's about, of course, Erdogan and Putin, that despite the long tradition of being in competition, these 2 countries seem closer to each other, because Erdogan and Putin like each other. And Erdogan, in this case, seems like following Putin's method of just acting. Anyway, let's move to the questions now. Let me start from Michał Baranowski, who is already with us. Hi, Michał. Thank you for following our panel. The question is apparently, well, about something we didn't really discuss yet. What if Trump wins? We cannot say yet, the elections are still in front of us. So do you see any suggestion, any idea? It's basically the question to both the diplomats. How to preserve the positive transatlantic agenda in this case, if Trump wins? Rolf, maybe.
Maybe Sandy first this time.
Or maybe.
Okay. Sure. I did address this a little bit in my opening remarks. Obviously, it's going to be very difficult to deal with a re-elected Trump who has no more constraints, doesn't have to worry about his re-election campaign, could follow through on some of the worst case scenarios, such as withdrawing from NATO, although there I think he'd face enormous pushback from the Congress, which could deter him from going all the way. But at the same time, we shouldn't give up on trying to manage what's left of transatlantic relations. I think because he's so transactional, the key, I think, is for Europe to kind of continue to engage, find ways to make itself useful in a transactional sense. Don't try to persuade him of the values-based nature of the alliance. None of that goes in one ear and out the other. But look for ways that Europe, both acting in the EU or European members of NATO by strengthening the European pillar, can actually do more that contributes to our mutual security. Trump may still have nasty rhetoric, but you might be able to convince him on a practical level to continue to work with allies and focus his rage on somebody else. So it's not going to be pleasant if he wins, but it may be possible to manage. And a lot of these problems of the US shifting its focus to Asia will be the same, as I said, under either a Biden or a Trump presidency. And it does put more of the burden on Europe to finally step up and be that equal partner that it styles itself to be.
Thanks a lot. Rolf, you want to add something?
Well, I don't share Sandy's optimism that much, I have to say, because I'm afraid that all what we see already now will be worse, and the consequences will be worse as well. I think there will be a strong push on the European side to do more things independently, not necessarily militarily, but politically. We may not be as ready to follow, let's say, a more forceful lead of the US on China if there is somebody there who asks us in a very nasty manner. It's I think something that should be really seen, that the consequences of a second Trump term, I think, at least from a German perspective, would be very, very difficult. And even though, of course, there are structural realities, and we would want to work together as much as we can, I'm afraid that the very basic foundation of our values, of the way we do business in the international sphere, will be further undermined. Multilateralism, I mean, is already under heavy stress. It will be probably under more stress, and to be very honest, I foresee very difficult times if Trump was re-elected.
Okay, let's see in a few weeks then. And now let's quote another question from Senator Crowell. Let me put it this way. The question is about the Europeans sharing intelligence resources, but the question could be put to NATO as well. Alexander mentioned this as one of the priorities. What is the situation real? What is really the the scale of what we can expect as sharing intelligence resources. Alexander?
It's still a very difficult subject because of the Cyprus membership in the EU. There's no, and I'm a few years out of date, but Robert Schelp maybe can confirm this, that NATO doesn't have a security agreement with Cyprus, and it limits NATO's capacity to share a lot of the more sensitive kinds of intelligence. That's further limited by the constraints that the nations who share that intelligence with NATO put on it. So that hasn't impeded NATO-EU cooperation on a lot of subjects, including hybrid warfare, which is itself delicate. But it depends on, I think, the informal networks in which the NATO members of the EU and a few other countries that have a high security clearance, like Finland and Sweden, are able to be in the lead and rely on information that they're getting through other channels, rather than direct NATO-EU intelligence sharing. So there are workarounds, but it's a difficult situation.
Wojtek, would you like to add to this question something?
No, I'm not actually an expert on intelligence, so I will not waste your time. I will rather answer some other questions if they occur. All right, thanks.
Or maybe Rolf?
No, I wouldn't be able to add something important either.
Okay, I'm following the questions. I just find the question from Paul Taylor. Greetings to Paul, and thanks for being with us as well. This is about Turkey, so I will not repeat this questions about the Turkey's increasingly aggressive foreign policy. So I will move to another one from Magdalena Mendes. We mentioned this already, but the question is about positive consequences of pandemic for transatlantic relations. Alexander was mentioning this. Maybe I will ask Rolf then, do you see any positive consequences of pandemic for transatlantic relations? That's the topic of our panel.
Yeah, well, first of all, I of course share Sandy's view about never miss a crisis or never waste a crisis. But also, I think I've alluded to that in my initial presentation as well, is that in the beginning, addressing the issue was really in the European Union, everybody for himself, the nations, borders were closed without consultation, no transparency, nothing. And now we've seen in the pandemic that multilateral solutions were by far superior to other solutions, and countries who have worked together, and I think in the European Union, I think we have done this, we have been able to do at least some positive things, including the very important financial package that we agreed in principle on. So I think the pandemic raised the awareness for multilateral solutions, and did in this way, in any case, create some positive consequences. How durable this will be, we will see. This is the second wave, and what we've seen in the beginning may come back again. I don't know, but we have, in any case, I think, made some progress on at least within Europe on the common addressing of the situation.
Thanks a lot. And the last question, because our time is over, maybe I will address it to Alexander. It's about information war. We haven't touched this subject yet. We mentioned cybersecurity, but information war is something different. And pandemic also shown that we are in the middle of this war. What is, in your opinion, the NATO answer to this situation that we are at war, we can say?
We certainly, in an ongoing information war, I mean, the Russians consider themselves at war with NATO in this gray zone between armed conflict and peace. And so we have to make sure that we're competing, recognizing what kind of an adversary we're dealing with. I think part of that is better understanding and being able to push back by debunking false information about our countries and about our policies. But I think a lot of the increased security starts at home. We have to do a better job of addressing the social issues that the Russians exploit through their information warfare, reduce our own vulnerability through educating our citizens on the need to be much more skeptical about the first thing that they see every day on the internet, and in a sense make ourselves more resilient so that there's less gain for Russia in practicing these methods. Now for NATO, there's particular requirements when it comes to debunking propaganda about NATO, but more importantly, equipping our military to deal on a day-to-day basis with the sort of continuing indirect warfare that Russia is carrying out in the information space. Will require much more rapid decision-making so we can be agile in responding to these kinds of information attacks right when they're happening, rather than spending days or weeks at NATO headquarters trying to figure it out. It does put a premium on more intelligence sharing as to what is behind information campaigns. NATO, I think, has strengthened its internal intelligence sharing, but as we discussed, it has constraints on dealing with key partners who may also be under the same threats. So it's a very big agenda. I think it starts, first of all, with recognizing that for Putin, we're already at war, and accept the logical consequences of that.
Thanks a lot for this answer, very clear. And we have to stop here. Thanks, gentlemen. Rolf Nickel, Alexander Vergeboe, and Dr. Wojciech Michnik were with us. Thank you all for watching. And now it will be a short break, and I invite you for the third panel.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Welcome everyone. It's wonderful to see you all, and thank you for staying with us for the last session. My name is Michał Baranowski, and I'm a director of the Warsaw office of the German Marshall Fund of the United States. It's fantastic to have with me three distinguished speakers, good friends, and thought-provoking thinkers. Robert Pszczel from NATO, Senator Klich from Poland, and Konstantin Foregert from Die Welt. Welcome all. We at the panel that we are focusing on the eastern flank and asking the question: is the eastern flank secure enough? And we can here explore whether it's an eastern flank of NATO, of EU, of the Western world, and so on. I've been struck listening to this very interesting conversation throughout the day, how little so far we have talked about Russia. It really does seem to be an afterthought, given our concerns with COVID, given our concerns with the upcoming US election, and of course the global competition between US and China. There were mentions here and there, but in this section, we really, in this panel, we really want to dive deeper into where we are vis-a-vis Russia, what Russia is doing, both on the military front and on the sort of more hybrid front, including cyber and informational threats. Let me kick off with, well, let me ask our panelists to kick off with a few minutes of their thoughts, and I would like to keep it as much conversational to to keep everyone engaged. We are now past 5:30, almost 6 o'clock, so we have to get the juices flowing. For some, coffee is warranted. For others, perhaps slowly a glass of wine or a good scotch. Very good, Senator Klich. Robert, let me first turn to you. From your perspective in the headquarters, although I see that you probably are back at your home, or maybe this is your office, which is very nicely decorated. Give us your perspective on the current state of the alliance on our eastern flank. If we were not having the COVID pandemic, we would be talking about transformation of NATO. We would be talking about the neighborhood between us and Russia that is on fire. We are talking about Belarus. We are talking about Nagorno-Karabakh. We are talking about poisoning of Navalny. But give us your assessment from NATO HQ on where we are when it comes to our preparedness to what we can expect from our eastern neighbor. Thanks.
Thank you, Michał, and thank you for the invitation to this excellent event. And my job is, in one hand, made easier by the fact that in the first session we had Camille, who, I think covered a very wide-ranging ground, and I think he presented a very comprehensive picture of what is NATO doing, how is NATO functioning, how is NATO coping with all the challenges that we have. So I don't want to, of course, go over the same ground, but for me, it's an important starting point because even though, perhaps let me do this the following. I mean, there is a question posed, right, for this panel. Let me try to answer it straight away and then explain maybe why I think is the answer. My answer to the question is the eastern flank secure enough is, if you stop the question secure, the answer is yes. Enough, well, in NATO, we don't particularly like this word because you can't tick the boxes when it comes to security, particularly hard security. So in other words, it's always something to do. And another point, which is again, drawing on what was said by many speakers, but I refer to Camille, he's my colleague from NATO, is that currently that you can't just look at the eastern flank in in isolation. You have to look at the whole range of jobs, if you like, of tasks that NATO is performing. Some of them because we're a political military alliance. So you need political consensus. You need to, as much as it is interesting and proper, that's what NATO does. We debate things. Countries come to the table and they have different views. But the starting point for specific actions, and that's what we're talking about, posture, military posture, exercises, how are various things organized, is the fact that we do have a political consensus. Oh yes, it is both the question, in a wider sense, is 360 degrees. In the more narrow sense, I mean, it didn't work very well. I'm home, so maybe you won't see it exactly, it cuts part of it. This is the current, I mean, the countries who actually participate in what we call the enhanced forward presence. And I think it's about 25 or 26 countries. Now that in itself shows that this is not some kind of a theoretical construct to which, countries come, sign under or agree to a nice communique, but we are doing things. And if I look at what's happening literally now, we have, I think people know this, of course, the concept is quite straightforward, is defense and deterrence, coupled with dialogue when it comes to Russia, but specifically when it comes to enhanced forward presence, it's part of a bigger picture. So we have 4 multinational battle groups based in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland, led by framework nations. But this is not all. We have lots of other things going on. So for example, what was in the news in the last days, right? We had a nuclear deterrence exercise in the Netherlands. More than 50 planes flying, particularly in the Atlantic North. It's, of course, defensive North life she was used, but it shows that is an important dimension. We have space declared as an operational domain. We have also, tailored presence in the south. Why? Because we need balance. We need to be able to answer any type of contingency. And of course, we do have contingency plans which cover all regions and all azimuths. But let me just give you two more examples, and I'll stop there because I think it's in this a good idea to have this much more interactive. If you look more closely, and I just literally read the list, when we talk about NATO's deterrence and defense in terms of concrete posture, we're talking about not only about enhanced forward presence, which I mentioned, which is of course key, and all the exercises we do. These troops are not there just on holiday, although they do have some nice moments, and I think the relationship with the host nation population is very good. That's very important. But we have also the Baltic air policy, right? Currently talking about Belgium, Denmark, Czech Republic, Czechia, Germany, Hungary, Poland, Portugal, Spain, US, a lot of countries participate. We have support and assurance assistance to Turkey, just mentioned so many times. That's happening. Different flank, but still part of a picture. We have standing naval forces. We have joint intelligence surveillance with various elements to this. We have AWACS patrols over Eastern Europe, performed by, AWACS, of course, NATO, property if you like, but France, Greece, Italy, Turkey, UK. We have regional hub from the south. I keep jumping from the region, but for us, it's part of the same picture. We have Iceland, peacetime preparedness, airspace. We have ballistic missile project. We have, let's not forget, enhanced NATO response force, very high readiness, and of course the forward presence. And let me finish back, but something which I find not just symbolic, but very good illustration of why I believe everybody is trying to pull their weight. We had just a visit, it's normal, there's a lot of political consultations. We had a visit at NATO HQ from the Estonian president on the 7th of October. And Secretary General spoke about, of course, Estonia, it's not the largest NATO member, rather probably they will not mind. I think should be called a rather smaller nation, but it's not just a country which hosts one of the elements of the enhanced forward presence. It's also the country which is one of the leaders when it comes to cyber defense, which is, again, across the board, does not recognize borders, if you like, hybrid, you mentioned. But it's also a country, for instance, which has been donating critical medical supplies to Italy and Spain, who has been supporting NATO partners such as Georgia and Ukraine. And that is a perfect example. And you could, and I could make this list longer. And speaking of specific assistance in time of COVID, right now, even though the ministers will look at this when they meet in a couple of days on our approach to what NATO can do more, which is happening probably the second wave of COVID, there have been already supplies of critical medical equipment provided to various countries in the Balkans, Albania, Montenegro, and North Macedonia. So we're not just speaking about things; we're doing them. We're doing them in a variety of ways, and in that sense, the eastern flank is as secure as it gets. But we need to work more because many illustrious speakers spoke before me. The security challenges keep multiplying and keep changing, keep sort of adapting. So we have to adapt to it. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Robert, for making the important points about also not separating the eastern flank and the southern flank and potentially the northern flank, but underlying the political consensus that we already have within the alliance. You said that we are secure, but enough, perhaps there is never enough. I would like to come back to this. What are other steps that we need to be taking, given that the security environment is certainly changing and is dynamic beyond the traditional hard military domain. Let me now go to Warsaw, or actually Poland. I'm not sure, Senator Klich, if you are in Warsaw, perhaps you are in beautiful Cracow. We are all virtually in beautiful Cracow, unfortunately virtually only for the moment. I want to turn to you for the same question. Are we secure enough? But perhaps you could focus a little bit also on the gaps that we are here that we need to fill in the coming months, in the coming years, given the political challenges that we are seeing on the horizon, or that are here already with both COVID and with the transatlantic tensions than the previous panel has discussed. Minister, Senator, over to you.
Thank you very much, Michał, for this invitation and for this opportunity to take part in that panel. I'm also satisfied, of this evolution that we witnessed during last years from, let's say, Readiness Action Plan that was established just after the invasion of Russia into the territory of Ukraine, especially after the illegal annexation of the Crimea, and this development that led us to both enhanced and tailored forward presence. Without doubt, this is a great achievement of the alliance. I'm also very satisfied, of all those capabilities that were deployed in this part of Europe, among others, in Poland. I'm taking into account, for example, the American presence of American troops and American equipment here in our country. Let me underline that during the recent discussion in both in the House and in the Senate, the opposition supported the new SOFA agreement between our country and US, although we had some doubts concerning both, jurisdiction as well as costs for the host country. It means for Poland. So these are achievements that are visible, that are important, and that should be taken into consideration when speaking about both deterrence and collective defense. So I'd like to concentrate rather on what is missing right now, and what are the questions, or at least one general question that we should answer. I would like to speak about the nuclear deterrence and the nuclear threat from the Russian side. Maybe because my first article in the underground press was published just after the INF Treaty was signed. It was in 1987. I published this article in 1988. And last year, in August, the US formally withdrew from the INF Treaty. And when I heard Secretary Pompeo saying that with the full support of our NATO allies, the US has determined Russia to be in material breach of the treaty and suspended it means American obligations under the treaty, that Russia is solely responsible for the treaty's demise. I tried to think about our response. What would be a joint American and European transatlantic response to this new situation? Because this treaty was one of the pillars of post or even late Cold War network of agreements limiting proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, as well as controlling the armament in this sphere. Of course, it was a conclusion of several reports on SSC-8 missile that Russia has been developing since the middle of last decade. Of course, when in February 2017, US officials reported that Russia had deployed two missile battalions, including SSC-8, we were convinced that there should be the collective response to that. But after the decision of the US to withdraw from the treaty, there is a gray zone in this sphere. On the other hand, we have ongoing modernization of Russia's nuclear capabilities. Let's take into consideration that deployment of first RS-20 ICBMs by 2021, so very soon, will replace older RS 36 will be a completely new sign. And on our hand, we have the recent decision not to prolongate the New START agreement, the last pillar of this construction of limitations of non-proliferation. According to the Heritage Foundation report, 82% of Russia's nuclear forces have been modernized. 82%, that's much. And of course, without any doubt, Russia still has the largest arsenal of nuclear weapons among the nuclear powers, of course, including short-range nuclear weapons. And Russia is still one of the few nations with the capability to destroy many targets in the US homeland, but also to threaten allied nations. That's without any capability. But we have to find the joint, common response to those threats connected with modernization of Russian nuclear capabilities, including also new threats coming from the other directions, mainly from China. But it should be the collective responsibility, because this is the collective challenge, because this is the collective threat. It doesn't refer also only to US security, it refers also to European partners' security, mainly to the security of countries being in central part of Europe, as long as intermediate range nuclear capabilities are concerned. So let me raise this issue, as one of the crucial issues, not only conventional issues, but also nuclear issues that we have to resolve, I hope, in much friendly atmosphere after the American elections in November this year. Friendly, it means not in transactional atmosphere, but in much more value-oriented mood. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator. And I think the important follow-up here conversation should be about also the upcoming ratification or not, and the negotiations over the START treaty that is coming up very soon after the new administration or the old new administration will take over. But let me now turn to Konstantin. Konstantin, it's great to have you with us. I wanted to, we've been now talking a little bit around Russia, but I wanted to zoom in a little bit because we are talking about nuclear challenges. We are talking about connecting the eastern flank and the southern flank. But when we look from Moscow's perspective, or if we look toward Moscow, we see fires all around the neighborhood, whether it's caused by President Putin, or it's at least not entirely stopped by, whether we look to Belarus, whether we look to Nagorno-Karabakh, or as I mentioned, to Siberia, where Navalny was poisoned. Give us your read of how the security situation looks a little bit from there, and what's, how worried what should we do given the instability on our borders, but also in a close neighborhood of Russia. Over to you.
Michał, dziękuję bardzo, and good evening to everyone. There's a small correction. I don't work for Die Welt, and I never will, actually. I work for myself. I happen to be contracted by Deutsche Welle to do the Russia commentary. But in spite of my name, I'm not even German. I'm partly Russian, partly Swedish, partly German, and partly Polish. And one of my distant relatives, died in the crash that Senator Klich investigated. Now, first of all, let me answer the question about the eastern flank. And I think that in a purely military sense, and I'm speaking to you now from Vilnius, I don't think that Putin is up to any immediate tricks militarily in this region. I don't think he has the time, I don't think he has the resources, and as you rightly pointed out, Michal, a lot of hotspots are on fire around him, and probably he doesn't have the time, and probably he doesn't have the guts for even a small mischief, which probably is possible in other circumstances. I mean, send in a few quote unquote veterans of Afghanistan to wreak some havoc in Narva for 40 minutes and then withdraw over the bridge and then see what's going to happen at the NAC in Brussels. But I don't think this is on the agenda. In terms of continuing propaganda exercise, information war, hacking, cyber war, espionage, that's all there. There's no doubt about that. He sees himself, as Sandy Vergeboe rightly said, he sees himself at war, and he's fighting this war, no matter what people in some of the Allied capitals think. Now, with regard to what you very, very rightly mentioned, the way I think they will look from Moscow, and I'm not speaking for Putin, thank God, I think that what they feel is that in terms of control of what used to be called the post-Soviet space, things are definitely slipping through their fingers. I would say that in my personal view, and I've been covering Belarus quite a lot recently, I think what happened in Belarus is the final coffin, nail in the coffin of what we call the post-Soviet space. That is not to say that everything is going to be wonderful in Belarus and it's going to be a model democracy and reincarnation of the Grand Duchy. No, but the idea of change that finally came to Belarus, it's another matter again, how this change and how this change will manifest itself in the end and how it will all finish, bearing in mind the fact, Belarus's dependence on Russia economically and socially in many other ways. That's another issue and that remains to be seen. But definitely the quietest, the most pliant, the most post-Soviet of the post-Soviet nations, at least in the European part of former Soviet Union, is now transformed, and it's an irrevocable transformation. So in a sense, I think this is something Putin still has to internalize. We don't know whether he can, because we do know, though, that he's increasingly living in this world of mega geopolitics, which is slightly airless, and in which in between ordering Mr. Mishustin to play with the ruble, he speaks to Churchill and converses with Ambassador Lipsky and does all these kind of wonderful things that then find expression in his opinion pieces. But I do think that another two hotspots are definitely worth mentioning, and that is, of course, the Caucasus, where Erdogan is getting at Putin via the Caucasus, wanting to settle his Libya scores. That is, by the way, very important, because what I think is this shows us that Putin's imperial overstretch, Putin's idea that the world is his oyster and and the Middle East is, like it was for Brezhnev, his big football pitch in which he plays against the United States, that may be starting to work against him. And by the way, the Israeli Gulf rapprochement, which happened without Putin knowing about it, is yet another signal that in the Middle East, he's not a top player, or he's becoming not the top player. And finally, I urge you to look slightly further east, and that is to the revolution in Kyrgyzstan, yet another attempt to create a state in Kyrgyzstan. I think that basically it happened without a lot of Russian participation. And we'll see whether there's enough Chinese participation there. And the China challenge is evidently there, but Putin pretends it's not there. I think what we see is, en somme, the first very clear manifestation, probably first after Ukraine, such clear manifestation that Russia is no longer the sole most important player in the post-Soviet space. China is moving in, and as someone who traveled before COVID to Central Asia quite a lot, I have to say it's evident. And now we see that Turkey is in the middle of Caucasus and is doing stuff which was completely unthinkable even 5 years ago. So I'd say that together with a major COVID outbreak in Russia now, that probably will push Putin to deal with things closer to home. And I think, and I'm going to stop here because I hope I will be able to continue a bit later. I think that a lot will now depend on what kind of conclusions people in the, first and foremost of all, allied capitals in Europe will come to. That is extremely important in view of Belarus, in view of the Navalny assassination attempt, which you rightly touched upon, which I'm probably going to touch upon a bit later, and what's happening in what used to be called the post-Soviet space. I think there needs to be a very important reckoning with what's happening, and I'm not sure that our friends in Paris and Berlin are yet ready for it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Konstantin. Very interesting and very
and Czech. A bit of rough.
Very good. I like the fact that you are taking advantage of past 6 o'clock, and very pessimistic if you look from Kremlin's perspective. I want to give actually everyone a chance to react to it, and also may perhaps slowly switch to thinking about how the relations with Russia should be dealt with. I mean, Konstantin, you mentioned in passing a reference to President Macron's efforts to, well, build a new dialogue, and with all the downsides that or lack of results that we have seen so far. The previous panel also importantly talked about the potential opening or rethink from the US side. So let me turn to Robert and then Minister Klich also for your thoughts, your reaction on the policy toward Russia. Robert, if I can, I know that you will have to run a little bit earlier. If I can throw one more sort of additional question to you that if you could react to, because we haven't touched too much in our panel on the NATO 2030 process. And if you could specifically address whether you expect a significant change coming from the process when it comes to the NATO's eastern flank, or whether this is much more of a focus on global NATO, the themes that Secretary General pointed to in his recent speeches. So, Robert, first to you, and then to another.
Thank you, Michał, and thank you for reminding me. Indeed, I have to go in literally 10 minutes. But first of all, I mean, Russia. Yes, I'm not sure if I mentioned Russia, but of course, Russia is there. You can't avoid it, and it does play. Its actions have led, and it's never enough to remind people. Probably not on a panel, but many people perhaps who listen in, that what we've been talking about, the eastern flank, this rotational presence, the exercise, and so on. It's primarily our reaction to Russia's actions, and the reason why today, while we speak about deterrence and defense and dialogue on their part, on the other side, dialogue is important, but there isn't that much of that dialogue. There is a bit. There are reasons for it. It's not of our making, and that should be stressed. But some issues which were mentioned, particularly by Konstantin. I mean, what is NATO's position? Well, NATO does have a position on the issue of Malne. I mean, this was a statement, very clear, calling essentially Russia to investigate properly. And there is no doubt, as was expressed, also particularly following the latest data pronounced by the OPCW that a meth agent belonging to this military, the group Novichok, has been detected, and the answers have to be provided, and that's a very firm position. With Belarus, we've also made very clear, Secretary General I think said it very clearly a couple of times, we are not undertaking any provocative actions, any military special activities. What we're doing has been long planned. We're very transparent. You can go to the NATO website and you can read about all these exercises. I tried to go and yesterday and looked at the Russian Defense Ministry. There's one exercise which took place already, and the previous one is like last year. Sorry, there's a big difference. But that's important because Belarus should not be used, apart from all the other issues, as a pretext, basically to crack down on people. And that point has to be driven. We know where we stand on this. NATO's position, all the allies, is crystal clear. And there's lots of solidarity when it comes to, for instance, diplomatic presentation. There's also MH17. Sadly, Russia does not want to cooperate anymore. I mean, the list is long. So the point is that we have a view and we react to it, both politically as an alliance, but also in very concrete terms. It's now October. In August, we had US bombers practicing in Europe. In fact, all the NATO countries, there's videos, there's photos. We don't do that just because, it's important, because that's part of our response. Interestingly, since Senator Klich sort of posed the question, for INF, in all honesty, I would say that we have already provided, we have elaborated an answer. That is all the allies. We have a mixture of measures that we have decided to undertake following essentially Russian violation of INF and the fact that they feel that they've deployed missile systems, including very close to to the countries, including Poland. And that's a mixture of both political and military. It's not by chance that the allies are acquiring, for instance, new generation fighter planes. We are, and it's not by chance that I also mentioned the exercise, speaking of the nuclear dimension. Strongly recommend the recent public statement, I think yesterday or even today, by the Dutch minister, where he speaks very clearly. And there is clear linkage made to some of the actions that, Senator, you have alluded to. In other words, what I'm saying is that the basis for NATO's work has to be consensus, but there is consensus. And the fact that, of course, we are not going to react to every single thing. We take a more long-term view. We are proportionate, we are defensive, we're very transparent. It's just the way we do business. And that shows also, by the way, and I'm glad that Satine brought it up, how we deal with disinformation, because it's part and parcel of this. I would say something immodest. I think we've become much better at both exposing, analyzing, and where we decide, acting, responding to it. There is a NATO report on this issue. There's information at the time of COVID, which we published on our website. And then I say we work very closely with the European Union. And there are many other examples also concerning partners, such as Sweden and Finland. There are good reasons why, defense budgets go up. So in other words, nothing is perfect. And there's lots of stuff on cyber and so on. Nothing is perfect. As I said at the beginning, enough is never enough because it's a work in progress. But I would argue very strongly that, while we will have this debate and 2030 process, I can't tell you too much because there is a group of very wise people, 10 of them, 5 women, 5 men, 1 from Poland, who are essentially discussing this with a lot of stakeholders, but it is up to the Secretary General then to take this. And he has spoken recently about his vision where we have to move. We need debate, and that's happening. So I can assure you that NATO is thinking ahead, but at the same time, because of the nature of the threats and challenges, and let's admit it, we cannot predict every single thing. However, we can damn well make everything possible to prepare ourselves for various eventualities. And that's what we're doing because that's our obligation, that's how it works. So I think I'll stop there, but I try to give you a comprehensive picture in those areas that I felt I have a mandate to do so, but I can't do it on behalf of the Secretary General when it comes to the results of the 2030 project, but it's a very important one.
Thank you very much, Robert. You can't blame me for trying to pull you out on that. We look forward to the results of the process. Before I turn to Senator Klich, let me just remind everyone that they can ask questions, post comments online via YouTube. It's right here. I can see your comments on another device. So and Robert, I know you have to run, so safe travels, and we'll see you next time. And well, let me turn to Senator Klich. Konstantin said a couple of things that I think I would like to unpack too, and see to what extent you agree, Senator, because you are someone who has worked on Poland's security and defense for many years, with Russia obviously one of the main challenges to our security. Konstantin said that there is no appetite in Russia for other foreign adventures, and I was struck also by the statement that the Belarus is the final nail in the coffin of a great Russia. Do you agree with that assessment, threat assessment also from Russia, and perhaps anything else that you would like to add at this? I then would like to switch a little bit to our conversation and include China as well. Senator, over to you.
Thanks a lot to Robert Pszczel for such a review of everything that was implemented during last years, including deployment of new capabilities in European countries in the aftermath of the end of the INF treaty. I admire everything that Robert presents, because this is a kind of education for many of our colleagues. But I would say that still there is a strategic, really strategic issue that was not resolved during last 6 years. This is the challenge that we faced in 2014 when the model of cooperative security was blown up by Russian invasion to Ukrainian territory. For years, for decades, we based our relationship with the Russian Federation on the assumption that cooperation is better than confrontation, that dialogue is much better than the clash with this partner. And let's still remember that our accession to NATO, I mean Poland's, Hungary's, and Czech Republic's accession to NATO was connected with the founding act with Russia when it was signed on the eve of our invitation. So, but we should remember that the model of cooperative security was undermined by this invasion, and still there is no new model of security. And with Russia, this new model of security is absolutely necessary, because Russia creates one of the pillars of international security, or the lack of security. So, what I'm absolutely convinced that it is not possible to do with Russia business as usual. That this principle, business as usual, should be excluded from our vocabulary as long as Russia doesn't return to respect for international obligations. And one of the international obligations, this is the stability of post-Cold War order in Europe. It means sovereignty of Ukraine, its internal territorial integrity, and this is the precondition for the new possible new chapter of relations with Russia. I have the feeling that we have to wait for this time, rather a long time, because Russia will not resign quickly of its aggressive posture towards the West. It was included into Russia's main documents, strategic documents, even those coming from first years of President Putin's term in office. But the unity of the West is absolutely necessary, on the other hand, to maintain those, let's say, weak sanctions that were introduced during last 6 years, once again, in the aftermath of the Russian invasion into Ukraine. But again, we should be very careful with those temptations that a kind of a new table with of negotiations with Russia should be reintroduced, despite Russian aggressive posture in the eastern part of Europe. It's rather better to prepare for, let's say, another wave of cyber attacks, intelligence influence, propaganda influence, or significant, let's say, energy market interventions from Russian Federation, then trying to make a new deal with the current aggressive posture of the Kremlin.
Thank you very much, Senator Klich. Very, very clear, and I think we do need to keep this message projected to our colleagues. Also, given the changes that we will be seeing in the US, in Germany as well. I have a question from Paul Taylor specifically to Konstantin that follows up very well on what Senator Klich just said. Paul is asking, and I'm going to just read. Thanks for the enlightening discussion. The question is, what should Paris and Berlin get ready for in Russia? And what would you have them do about it? Konstantin, what can we expect and what we should do about it?
Well, I don't know what we can expect, but I think that although Robert was presenting this very nice, coherent picture of NATO allies doing everything together, let us see what they're doing separately. And I think that if you look at what Berlin and Paris were doing over the Navalny poisoning and over Belarus, is still quite timid. And that gives me an understanding that there is no understanding still in Berlin, or probably desire not to use the understanding. That's probably the best way to describe it. I think there's more understanding of what Putin's Russia is in Berlin than it is in Paris. But I think that the attitude is still insufficient. First of all, there is still this attitude as if Putin has been around for only a couple of years and there's a long life ahead. Let me tell you, you asked me to kind of, Michal, to help the juices run a bit faster. Well, I'll tell you something. Everything we've seen in the last year, including response to COVID, including these fires across the post-Soviet space, including demonstrations in Khabarovsk, in Moscow, everywhere. This is a regime that is in permanent and irreversible decline. That is not to say that tomorrow it will end, but this is a regime which has nothing new to offer to the Russian people and to the world. So I think the West in general, and Paris and Berlin, since you asked Paul in particular, have to get used to the idea that they have to start thinking about the post-Putin Russia. Number one. Number two, I think that what people in Berlin, for more practical reasons, and in Paris, for more probably ideological reasons, do not gather, is that any attempt at showing moderation is seen as a weakness by Moscow. So when Germany says, oh yeah, you know, we're going to do everything by the book and we're going to receive Navalny and so on and so forth, but we're not going to do anything about Nord Stream 2, they do not understand, and probably they don't understand, they don't want to act on it. That Nord Stream, we're not talking about whether Nord Stream is really an important economic project or whether it's a waste of money on which Gerhard Schröder made tens of minutes. It's not about that. The signal that you send, if you want to be taken seriously, is that you are prepared to suffer to win in the game. And that is not a signal we're getting from Berlin. And that is definitely not a signal we're getting from Paris when Monsieur Macron comes to Vilnius and lectures President Nausėda about how they have to leave behind all the historical grievances and rejuvenate their dialogue with Moscow. He's talking to a president of a country where French soldiers are prepared to die on the border. Now, tell me who is advising him on foreign policy. I'd like to speak to this person. I think that it's quite, to me, it's quite unconvincing yet that there is realization among European NATO allies that there is nothing to be had with Putin. As simple as that. Nothing. Zero. Zilch. Nullis, as they would say in Vilnius. Because Putin is not interested in deals. He's interested in unconditional surrenders, several, small. But he's interested in a game on his terms. And by the way, since America was mentioned, if you look at it from, let's say, my perspective and perspectives of my friends in different Central European capitals, including post-Soviet space, my friends in the Russian, at least some people in the Russian opposition, not all of them. Well, I mean, basically the Trump presidency didn't make a big difference in terms of what happened with regard to Russia. Sanctions are in place, some more were added. Arms were sent to Ukraine, by the way, which Obama didn't do. Yes, Trump did not condemn Navalny's poisoning. Bad. Well, I'm not saying it's a great administration. What I'm saying is that I'm afraid histrionics about Trump are very frequently just a very convenient pretext to avoid taking a stance with regard to Russia and to China in several European capitals. When the esteemed Botschafter Nickel says that we are going to be slightly different on China, in the same breath as he takes about values that underpin the European policy as opposed to the crude developer from New York, I'm laughing. I'm terribly sorry. This is pure Putinism. When you say white is black and black is white. And that is, I'm afraid, what we hear from the European capitals all and all and all repeatedly. Not all of them, some. And I think that as long as you say values but Nord Stream, as long as you say values but we are going to relaunch security dialogue, as long as you say values but we need Putin in Syria and Libya, what for? He's part of the problem, not part of the solution. Then Putin is winning. And I'm afraid he's going to continue to win for some time because I'm not sure this trend will end very soon. So I think that, I'm not saying that Putin is the biggest issue, but I think what we need to be used to is that we are going to have a string of American administrations that will be distracted from Europe. I don't think that Joe Biden or Kamala Harris, who probably doesn't know who Europe is, will immediately rush to say, oh, by the way, it's going to be everything as if it was under Clinton. No. China is going to preoccupy US power for the foreseeable future. And I think we all have to start living with that. And by the way, Russia will have to live with it even more than everyone else because it borders Russia. So I think we have to really stop thinking in terms of, congratulatory 2004 style NATO summits. The world has changed. The US has changed. And Russia is changing. And as long as you don't see that it's changing, as long as you think that Putin is going to be there in 15 years still doing the same thing, you may not be prepared to the change that will come. I'm really sorry to sound sometimes probably slightly offensive.
Thank you, Konstantin. It's always good for conferences to have controversial, strong statements. So please don't be sorry. I just wish we had still online a couple other colleagues from previous panels to engage, especially colleagues both from Berlin, Paris, and perhaps also Washington, where I believe that this debate will be brewing, especially with new administration, as you know, as Sandy Vergeboe pointed out. This is not another look to a reset with Russia, but there is certainly a discussion brewing about a rethink of relations with Russia. We are coming slowly to a close. I have another question that I wanted to pose to Senator Klich, if you could take it. It's a question from Emmeline Quentin, and she's asking basically, how do we reconcile position of countries that are eager to engage with Russia, open a dialogue at the least. She says open a dialogue, so let's not say engage, but open a dialogue with countries that it's not possible to do it. So what is the golden middle in our diplomacy toward Russia in the Western more united approach, given all the challenges that Konstantin just pointed to as well? Senator, over to you.
Without doubts, this is a challenging job and very hard work to do that. And I appreciate, you know, those countries that are still in favor of, first of all, maintaining sanctions against Vladimir Putin and his collaborators that were decided in the aftermath of the Ukrainian invasion of Russia. That's first. Secondly, I appreciate also, you know, that finally it was possible to introduce sanctions on Lukashenko and his collaborators because they supported those that we should support, you know, in our neighborhood. I mean, protesting free Belarusians. So from that point of view, we should continue this policy of maintaining sanctions. And this is the question, and the future of this policy is connected with the question of the leadership in Europe and leadership in transatlantic area. As for the transatlantic area, we have to wait by the end of the campaign in the United States, and we shall see what will be the result of this campaign. Those statements that were sent to Europe, especially to Central European countries, especially to Poland, by Joe Biden himself, although it was a mistake to compare Poland and Belarus, and I have to underline that as one of the leaders of the opposition. But I keep in mind, you know, especially those official statements that were sent to Poland, and the recent interview with Michael Carpenter, that knows very well both Poland and this region, and has the pro-European approach. So they are promising. They are promising that the US will try to re-engage and will try to return, you know, to this position of the leader of values and the leader of the Article 5 approach, understood in a traditional way. I mean, in the way of the commitment, not in a business-oriented way, transactional way. So that's first. Secondly, this is the question about the leadership in Europe, in the European Union. And I would wish to see, you know, my country, Poland, on board, together with Germans and French, as it was several years before, being on board concerning, you know, the future of the common security and defense policy, trying to avoid what Radek Sikorski recalled during the first session. I mean, the destruction of those instruments that we set up during last years. I mean, European Defense Fund, PESCO development within the framework of PESCO, etc., because of the lack of resources. So this discussion about the multi-annual financial framework for next 7 years should include our strong push, strong engagement on the side of those who are in favor of reinforcement of CSDP, because without CSDP and without effective CFSP, we will not be able to achieve any goals in our neighborhood.
Thank you very much, Senator. Let me go with the final question and comment to Konstantin. One thing you wanted to mention something from previous sort of moment, but I wanted to also ask you with what Senator Klich finished with, his expectation of the upcoming US election and potential Biden's administration, and this is also what we started with this conference. So when it comes to the policy toward Russia of possible Biden's administration, are you as optimistic, neutral, or pessimistic what we can expect from the next president of the United States, if it happens to be Joe Biden, of course?
Thank you very much, Michal. Briefly, number one, with regard to the US, I think, well, at least that's the way I see it. It's a very personal view. I think that with regard to Russia, the main influencers are not in the White House, no matter who sits in the White House, by the way. Our experience is that it's the Congress, where you have more or less a bipartisan understanding of threats posed by Putin's regime, and significant swathes of professional bureaucracy, which doesn't change irrespective of who is sitting in the White House. I think these are more sure, more certain sort of bets, if you wish, looking at the Russia policy. We'll see how it develops, but I do think that we still have to see whether consequences of Navalny poisoning will manifest themselves in the US too. Another thing I'd like to remind you about is that probably in a year and a half, in 2 years, but anyway, we're awaiting the verdict of the court in The Hague regarding the MH17 thing. I never tire of speaking about it because it is, maybe you'll think it's strange, but it is one of the most significant bad things that can happen to Putin. Which brings me to, because no one wants to be called a war criminal. Number three, that brings me to another very important point, and that is Ukraine. I'm afraid that Ukraine, because of the Zelensky presidency, because of the state capture by oligarchs, is kind of slightly forgotten today. And I think that this is wrong. No one forgot about Kuwait, in spite of the fact that in 1990, women didn't have the vote in there. But I think that Ukraine shouldn't be forgotten. And as long as it's not forgotten, it's a big headache for the Kremlin. Number four, I think it's an important thing that, and I hope it will remain a bipartisan policy, no matter what cabinet will be in Warsaw in several years or in Vilnius in a week. I'm very, very inspired by the Polish-Lithuanian leadership on Belarus. That is the kind of thing that should be shown to the European Union. This is what, to a large extent, did not let other people in the EU say, well, this is all, kind of Putin land, forget about it. I hope that this will continue. That is a very positive example of what Central Europe and the Baltics can do and where they really show leadership. And the last thing, coming back to what Secretary General Stoltenberg said a couple of weeks ago, I think, to the Georgians. I'm going to be very provocative. I should have started with that. Give Georgia a map. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Konstantin. This is definitely a way to throw an idea at the end. Yes, we definitely like it. I wanted to thank you both, and of course Robert as well, for this fascinating discussion. Really capping a full day of a great conversations. I was asked about by the organizers to bring our conference to an end. So I wanted to thank you, and I wanted to thank all the participants online for joining us. This was I managed to really listen throughout the day, and I found it a fascinating discussion. So I hope you did too. And really we look at all different aspects of how COVID is impacting our global security architecture, and in ways it's not impacting global security architecture. So on behalf of the organizers, on behalf of the Institute for Strategic Studies and Ms. Anna Szymańska, who is with us online, but a little bit hidden from you, I wanted to thank you. And I very much hope that for the 30th edition of the conference, we'll be able to meet in person in beautiful Cracow and have enough of mitigating ways that we could actually see each other with arms and legs, not only over Zoom. Thank you for joining us, and see you next year. Thanks.
Thank you as well.
Thank you. Thanks a million. Bye-bye.
Congratulations to everybody.
Thank you.
Congratulations.